The Inner Experience by Jacobo Grinberg, Zilberbaum, 1975. Preliminary Note by Bending Realities. The Inner Experience, written in 1991 by Mexican author Jacobo Grinberg, is a groundbreaking book that delves into the depths of human consciousness. In this work, Grinberg seeks to explain how we perceive reality and how our minds construct the internal experience that defines our existence. This book is particularly relevant today, in a world that urgently needs to reflect on the connection between the material and the spiritual, and explore how self-awareness can help us face contemporary challenges. Jacobo Grinberg was a Mexican psychologist and neurophysiologist born in 1946, renowned for his innovative research on perception and consciousness. Influenced by his academic training and his encounters with indigenous spiritual traditions, Grinberg developed a unique perspective that blends science and spirituality. His life and work were marked by an unrelenting quest to answer the great questions of the human mind, until his mysterious disappearance in 1994, a phenomenon that continues to intrigue and fascinate many. This book is particularly notable for being Grinberg's first, written when he was only 29 years old, showcasing an impressive level of intellectual and philosophical maturity for his age. Throughout its pages, the author combines scientific concepts, philosophical reflections, and spiritual teachings, creating a work that is both accessible and profound. Additionally, the text lays the foundation for what later became known as his synergic theory, a model that aims to explain the interaction between consciousness and reality. For those eager to enjoy this work in English, The Inner Experience has been carefully translated by the Bending Realities team, enabling this profound message to transcend linguistic boundaries and reach a global audience. The Inner Experience is not only a testament to Jacobo Grinberg's brilliance, but also a call to introspection and the exploration of the deepest mysteries of our minds. Now, with access to this audiobook in English, its message has the potential to inspire new generations around the world. Introduction. The psychology which is currently most widespread and successful, and which has undergone the most pronounced development, is that which considers as the essence of psychological knowledge the analysis of the external manifestation of an organism's activity, especially that which is related to motor activity. The importance of this analysis is not discussed here, but rather the approach that has been given to it. Motor activity is handled as if it were the direct and unquestionable manifestation of the mediating processes, and this apparently obvious connection is never questioned. The psychologist who studies motor manifestation has absolute confidence that his study will lead him to understand what is going on inside the organism, without the need to penetrate it. He has the same approach as the electroencephalography scholar, who believes that by analyzing the trace of a pen, he has access to the knowledge of what is going on in the brain, without knowing that much of the activity only represents noise, or the deformation imposed by the size of the electrodes and the electronic system used. The study of motor activity itself is only a chapter of the physiology of the pyramidal and extrapyramidal systems, and should never constitute the essence and basis of psychological knowledge. The behavioral manifestation may or may not be directly related to the internal activity of a subject. Indeed, it may represent exactly the opposite of what it is supposed to represent. If we try to analyze this manifestation in itself, there is no discussion. But if we pretend to consider that a subject is its behavioral manifestation, we fall into the danger of accepting as evident that which has not been able to be fully submitted to experimental proof. The commentaries that make up this work question the postulate, according to which one is what one manifests. It is not intended that they constitute irrefutable evidence. This can only be decided by those who read them. It is simply an attempt to raise the question and to warn those who like to handle postulates as if they represented unquestionable truths. The comments also analyze another principle that is apparently evident, and as such is handled by current psychology, that reality exists outside the organism, being able to differentiate between an internal and an external reality. This postulation seems absurd to me, although logical, because it comes from human beings who have been subjected to the process of socialization that has been imposed on them. On this point, there is already experimental evidence that casts doubt on the postulation. We know, for example, that the perceptual process is fundamentally of an active type, that the encoding of information is a process that implies a construction rather than a recapitulation. From this point of view, it is we who construct reality. This reality that we call external is nothing more than a description that has been stably constituted through a process of socialization, which, at bottom, is nothing more than a simple emotional blackmail. Even from a purely physiological point of view, or better still, starting from a physiological knowledge, it becomes evident that everything that happens only happens inside us. Concrete evidence in this sense is provided by studies of potentials provoked in different brain structures, which change depending on the internal state of the organism, even when the stimulus that provokes them keeps their physical characteristics constant. The comments cast doubt on the goodness of the socialization process. Implicit in them is the idea that by socializing a subject, the only thing we do is to impede his development, since we cast doubt on his capacity to make decisions and thus prevent him from achieving self-respect. Thus, we form subjects who only manifest in their behavior what is expected of them, and who, for the same reason, have a complete affective nullity. Finally, the comments make clear the idea that there is no determinism, that this is only apparent in the motor behavioral manifestation, which, undoubtedly, can be subjected to control. This possibility of control and the postulation that the subject is its manifestation explain this approach held by contemporary psychology, but in no way validate or prove it, since the argument, if it has any ingenuity, is that of being completely circular and ad hoc. The work is divided into two parts. The first presents a series of stories, and the second contains the actual commentaries. Both the stories and the commentaries are random in their order. The only order was determined by the chronological succession of the experiences that made me remember them. I would like to thank Celia Arellano for her collaboration in the writing. To Dr. Lazaro Briner for his patient revision of the manuscript. To Lizette RDT and Marianella Garcia for the awakening. To Anna Soni for everything we learned together. Part 1 Tales, The Fish and the Bird. A goldfish was amazed by the flight of birds. He liked to look out over the surface of the water and see how the swallow moved across the open space by flapping its wings. He loved to analyze its movements and think that these allowed it to reach great speeds. He understood the mechanism of flight, and he wanted to fly. A swallow was amazed by the swimming of the fish. He liked to fly over the pond to see how the goldfish, by wagging its tail, moved in the clear, cool water. She loved to analyze the way the fish hovered, motionless and effortless, and how in a jiffy it changed its position. He understood the mechanism of swimming, and he wanted to swim. One sunny day, the swallow spoke to the fish. "If you teach me to swim, I will teach you to fly." And the fish replied with a smile, "Deal." From that moment on, they became friends. The fish explained to the swallow all the secrets of swimming, and taught it how to fold its wings and move in such a way that it could penetrate the water and move in it. The swallow, in turn, taught the fish how to acquire sufficient momentum in an upward motion from the depth of the pond. He explained that this momentum would bring him out of the water, and that, once in space, he would have to move his tail, and so he would be able to fly. Learning was slow and risky, but the time came when all the movements were learned, and it was decided to make the final test. The swallow, anxious, said to the fish, "You are ready to fly, now you must try." And the fish, worried, replied, "You are too, if you wish you can swim." The two prepared themselves, took a deep breath, and after a moment's hesitation, they dared. Someone, at the edge of the pond, had a fantastic vision. He saw a goldfish flying and a swallow swimming. When they met again, they both noticed that each had a special gleam in their eyes. It was a deep and serene reflection. The fish looked at his companion and said, "When I was flying, I made a discovery. I felt I could know you as I never imagined before. I lived my flight being you, being me." The swallow, blushing, replied, "I felt the same." The fish, frowning, looked at a leaf floating in the pond. It seemed to want to say something very difficult or painful. The swallow demanded, "Say it at once. I also discovered something else. I learned that my swimming is no different from your flying. I felt that before I had swum like an automaton, and that I had forgotten that swimming is also beautiful too." The fish did not dare to finish. It looked in one direction and then in another, avoiding the swallow's sight. The swallow waited in thought. Finally, the fish continued, "Besides, I understood the reason for forgetting. I only saw your flight. I wanted to be like you. I thought that mine could not be as beautiful as yours. Now I know that both are beautiful." The swallow smiled, approached the fish, and embracing him, confided, "We have both learned the same thing. Nothing from this moment on will be the same. My flying will be the most wonderful thing, and so will your swimming. You will be in me and I in you, but we will both be what we are, and nothing will be better and nothing can teach us more." They say that from that day on something strange was happening near the pond. A goldfish was learning to swim and a swallow to fly. The Bee and Her Hive. A silvery moving surface full of stars, a warm moist vapor rising from the coolness, a sunny day and a lake, a red volume with an excited center, erect pistils, sensual, expectant of pollen, a flower, a changing sound, harmonic and pure, a song of life, virile and delicate, intense and naive, a nightingale. A honeycomb, dark, cold, mathematical, ordered. The bee acts 38 inside, licking the cells, taking care of its cleanliness, obsessive, methodical in its movements, determined and structured, imprisoned. A sun, a lake, a flower, and a nightingale, outside, order, rigidity, structure, and agreement, inside. One day something happened in the honeycomb. A wax bread broke loose from its mooring and, falling, cracked one of the walls. The BX-38, in anguish and panic, ran to the place of the catastrophe. Light was pouring in through the crack, a dazzling warm glow, and fresh air with mountain steam. BX-38 could not stand it. Nothing exists outside the honeycomb. No one is outside the geometry and the perfect structure of the cells. Such was the order. The X-38 fixed the crack, placed the wax in its proper place, and went to rest. She didn't want to remember, a golden, warm thread and a smell of mountain freshness. But the vision came back and back, and a very faint, timid thought began to be heard. There are things you don't know. It's not all structure. Something outside. The next morning, BX-38 approached the accident site, touched with his antennae the arrangement made the day before, trying to find some point that had not been left airtight. He found no mistakes. A thought came. Very good. You will be congratulated on the arrangement. You can feel proud. The bee felt puzzled. Before, the thought would have given her maximum assurance, but now she could not feel completely happy. She said to herself, "This feeling is absurd. A bee should not think, it should only do its job well." Now calmer, she went off to clean, tidy, and build cells. The bees at her side did the same. Then everything was fine, fixed and safe. 3 days later, a sound penetrated the hermetic walls of the honeycomb. It was a sweet, harmonious song. The workers looked at each other. It was necessary to thicken the walls so that no sound would interrupt their work. BX38 felt an intense desire to continue listening, but since all her companions thought it was important to thicken the walls, she went to help them. Strange feeling, X38 was not thickening the walls like her companions. She saw herself doing it. A bee can't think about itself, let alone see itself. Something strange was happening. There was light and warmth and smell and song. The next morning the search began. BX38 had disappeared. There would have been no problem if the disappearance had been the result of an accident. If X38 had been killed or abducted, no one would worry, but the disappearance had not been accidental. X38 had been caught on her own wings, coming out of the honeycomb. Never had such an affront and such treachery been seen. It was necessary to find her, to convince her that the honeycomb was the only thing that existed, that everything else was a fantasy and a danger. BX38 was admiring the lake. She had never felt so happy. She felt the coolness of the water, smelled the delight of the flower, and sang with the nightingale. There was no time for more. 4.3 light-years from Alpha Centauri. At 4.3 light-years from Alpha Centauri, at the intersection of the Griff and Sun-Tawward lines of nuclear magnetic splitting, the 26th Conference of the Peoples of the Universe WZ38H takes place. There is great anticipation to hear Yun, delegate of the DIPSI Sun constellation. Yun has developed a detection system that can locate highly integrated anti-entropic systems and also find out their internal structure. Yun is a graduate of the famous Andromeda Antientropic Research Institute and, as such, has always believed that 20 billion is the minimum number of elements necessary to achieve a mechanism with pandeterminism. For 2 eons, Yun has been gathering information that will allow him to verify this idea, and now, at the 26th conference, it has been announced that he will present the definitive reports on the subject. Sill, chairman of the conference, takes the floor. Dear delegates of the peoples of our universe, we have gathered once again in order to know the result of the researches about the evolution of the anti-entropic systems. Since the discovery of the Great Gardelli, we have met annually for 26 eons to determine what are the characteristics of these systems. We have come to the conclusion that antientropic systems evolve from the moment a structure becomes complex enough to advance from absolute determinism to self-determinism, and from there to a state we have termed pandeterminism, where the system is not only able to fix its laws, but also to change the entropic relations of the surrounding universe. The state of pandeterminism occurs when a system is able to represent the universe to itself, this representation being sufficiently accurate and certain to be more real than its surroundings. Research to date has indicated that there is an abrupt step between self and pandeterminism, and that a system belongs to one category or the other. Today, Yun will present us with data pointing to the existence of an intermediate state that possesses very special characteristics, but it will be better if Yun himself explains it to us. The energized spheres changed hue, signifying that a state of expectancy had been provoked by the chairman's words. Yun ordered his thoughts and began to transmit them. Each of the delegates began to follow Yun's experiences, as if they were their own. First, he showed them the mechanism of the anti-entropy detector, then all the steps of its development and the problems of its construction. It was as if they had experienced what Yun had experienced. Everyone admired the presentation technique he used, while it was true that as pandetermined systems, everyone could transmit experiences. The perfection in the mastery of this technique was unmatched in Yun. As Yun explained, the anti-entropy detector was based on the principle of transmolecular holography and was coupled to a Masonic detection gun that swept a portion of space and located any point showing self-stable molecular organization. Most of the detections revealed systems smaller than 5 billion elements, and these were classified as Class 1 antientropic, i.e., without self-determinism. In scan number 256,000, a system of 12 billion elements was located, the only case that would allow testing the hypothesis that 20 billion was the lower limit of pandeterminism. From that discovery, Yun devoted all his attention to establish the characteristics of such a unique system. The first thing he observed was that the system was kept activated by a complex, energizing infrastructure that oxygenated and fed it. He then realized that the system and its infrastructure remained active for a ridiculous amount of time, corresponding to between 80 and 100 orbits of the planet that supported it. The system could only communicate through alterations in the pressure of the surrounding atmosphere, and could only move from one point to another by activating certain extensions of its infrastructure. Both the alterations in atmospheric pressure and the activation of the extensions were governed by a series of rules established by a community of systems. There was definitely no sign of pandeterminism, and hardly any sign of self-determinism. However, at times, the system acted as if it possessed both. This greatly intrigued Yun, who could not understand what caused the fluctuations he was detecting. He decided to make an in-depth study of the system at different stages of its development. To do this, he first located a one-quarter life orbital system and ran through all its experiences. Yun summarized the data obtained as follows. The early stages of development of this system are characterized by a continuous growth of circuits establishing connections between its constituent elements. The circuits and their connections reach a self-stable degree between the first and third orbital of life. The particularities of the circuits allow an internal representation of the immediate universe and even a germ of pandeterminism. However, this does not develop. The reasons for this lack of development result from the emphasis these systems place on the maintenance of a social determinism. At that point, Yun sensed a hint of doubt among the delegates, so he decided to pass on a recently detected scene that exemplified and gave value to the above conclusion. A fantastic and never-before-seen vision then appeared. A place enclosed by rectangular blocks, and in the center, a sort of box surrounded by bars. Inside the box was an elongated shape with 5 extensions. 4 of them ended in 5 tentacles, and the other had a spherical shape. Embedded in the sphere were 2 lateralized oval shapes and 3 frontal cavities, in addition to a central excrescence in the lower portion of which 2 small holes were visible. Strangest of all, in the upper portion of the sphere protruded an extraordinarily large number of thin tentacles that changed place when that pink, elastic and hot form changed position. The illumination of that place was dim, and the form moved continuously. At a certain moment, the lower frontal cavity began to contract, and as a result of this movement, complex changes in the position of the surrounding molecules began to be noticed. Eva, the child's mother, heard her son talking in his sleep. She decided to get out of bed to go and see what was happening. Joseph, her husband, began to get upset by the noises the woman was making, but she shushed him with a quick and demanding movement of her arms. It was 3 o'clock in the morning and it was drizzling outside. Eva covered herself with a shawl and approached the crib where her son was. Her son, wide awake, told his mother, "Mommy, the bear was very big and was flying in the air. He was looking for his little son who was lost in the forest, and suddenly an eagle appeared and wanted to eat him." While the child was talking, Eva was thinking worriedly. Every night the same thing happens. No matter how much I have explained to him that those things he sees are just dreams, and therefore have no reality, he doesn't understand. I have to do something drastic, otherwise we'll never be able to sleep at ease. Eva turned on the light and looked for a book of prints, opened it to the image of a bear and showed it to her son. "Look, this is a bear, but it's not a real bear, it's just a painted bear. It doesn't exist, it's just a drawing. The bear you saw is not real either. It is like this drawing. It only exists in your little head when you dream. It is not like the bears at the zoo, they are real, the others you only imagine them." The child looked at his mother with wide eyes, and with an astonished expression, repeated, "The bears in the notebook and the bears at night are not real. Only the bears at the zoo are real." The mother continued, "Your dad and I need a good night's sleep because we work a lot during the day. And you, with your stuff, don't let us rest. If you wake up again at night imagining nonsense, the only thing you're going to do is make us angry, and we won't love you anymore." Saying this, Eva left the room. Juanito could not understand. He was sure that the bear he had seen was as real as the one in the zoo, but if his mother said it wasn't, and if they were going to stop loving him, he could not understand it. "The bears in the notebook and the bears at night aren't real, only the bears at the zoo are real." Yun tuned out the image. He felt uneasy and began to transmit. "When we first detected this experience, we thought there was some technical flaw. Such blindness and selfishness were not possible. A system of 12 billion elements should be more intelligent and at least recognize the path of its evolution, driving it and never inhibiting it. It was absurd and inconceivable, but it was no technical failure. The detector was checked a dozen times, and everything worked perfectly. The only possible conclusion is that the system studied possessed the capacity of internal representation and therefore was very close to pandeterminism. However, this capacity was not encouraged but, on the contrary, inhibited, and he conveyed this conclusion. The effects of this inhibition are manifold. Developing systems, subjected to similar treatments, begin to lose their ability to represent the universe to themselves, and in addition, lose their self-determinism by ceasing to rely on the existence of an internal reality and having to submit to the reality judgment given by the other system. Yun switched the experience transmitter back on. Again, a space surrounded by rectangular blocks, though larger than that of the previous vision. A multitude of shapes were covering the base of the space and appeared to be folded in half and resting on certain thin oval-shaped structures. In front of them, a larger shape contracted its lower frontal cavity. Dear colleagues, the International Psychiatric Society is honored by your presence. Today, 2 cases worthy of attention will be presented. The first one, a 6-year-old boy with clear symptoms of schizophrenia. Juanito was writhing in his bed. In the morning, he had gone to his school, and during the class of aesthetic activities, the terrible headache and nausea had started. Juanito looked at his classmates, and then at the teacher, to whom he said almost in tears, "I can't imagine it, it's not real." The teacher, angry, repeated for the umpteenth time, "The only thing I want you to do is to imagine a bear flying, and then paint it on the blackboard." I can't. The teacher felt he was about to explode. As he had never seen such stubbornness, he decided that this would be corrected with a punishment. What happens is that you don't want to. You are a rude and stupid child. As punishment, I want you to write the following 100 times. Children should behave well. They should obey their elders, for they know what is right and what is wrong. Yun switched off the image. It was the ultimate incongruity, and everyone felt that way. They could not understand how a system of 12 billion elements could fall into such contradictions. Syl began to transmit a question. What is the second case? Yun looked into Syl's eyes. They had both received the usual electroconvulsive treatment the night before. As usual, only that oppressive feeling and the terrible urge to cry had remained. They tried to speak, but they couldn't. It was dark, vague, empty. They looked at each other. 4.3 light-years away from Alpha Centauri, 2 psychiatrists were chatting in a cafe. You know, I feel very proud. The new method of electroconvulsive therapy is giving very good results. Yes, I've noticed. Your patients seem to be calmer. If all goes well, they will soon be able to be productive again. Master Augustus. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Master Augustus left the meeting. His bearing was majestic, his hands were clasped behind his back, and he walked thoughtfully. It was said that whenever Augustus achieved a success, he always adopted the same posture. He went to the pillar room, and after adjusting his glasses, went out into the garden. The night was cool and smelled of peaches. Augustus took a long, deep breath and began humming the last movement of Mahler's Fourth Symphony. He had seldom felt better than at that council meeting. In the very presence of the president, he had developed the most profound analysis in living memory of an event in the last World War. It had all started with the conversation he had had 6 months earlier with the former British officer during a flight from New York to Hamburg. He had planned to review on the plane the lecture he had prepared for the Board of University Chancellors to be held the following day. He did not plan to talk to anyone, but sitting next to him was the person with the most interesting physiognomic features he had ever seen. Immediately, the conversation began. Augustus explained that he was chancellor of one of the greatest universities in the world. His seat neighbor was talking about his experiences as a former British officer during World War II. We were 40 kilometers from the concentration camp. Our superior had informed us that the Russians were approaching the camp to occupy it, and that we should go ahead of them. The reason for the rush was dramatic. There were a dozen children and about 20 women left alive in the camp. The caretakers of the prisoners had been ordered to kill them the next day. The only way to save them was to arrive that very night to occupy the facility by surprise. The regiment set out, and at 5 a.m. we sighted the camp. It was a set of barracks surrounded by a double fence, and a group of rectangular towers ending in huts with searchlights. The early morning was foggy and cold, and the thought of what could be happening inside the barracks made us feel in an unreal world. The plan of attack was excellent and would allow us to occupy the facilities by surprise. At 6 a.m. we were inside. The only thing we found were corpses and 3 caretakers hiding in a basement. 2 of them were robust and their age could have been 30 or 32. The third was a slender blonde girl no older than 28. The accompanying corps of psychiatrists decided to interview them. The meeting was held in the barrack of the one who was head of the camp. There was a long table and 6 benches. 3 of them were occupied by the psychiatrists and the rest by the 3 women. Dr. Ray asked them, "We would like to know the reason why you, mothers of families with children, murdered defenseless children and women who had done them no harm." None of them answered. They seemed not to have listened. The question was repeated in German a dozen times with the same result. A shocked expression and silence. They simply did not understand what was being asked. Master Augustus told of the conversation to his superior, and the latter, in turn, to the chairman of the council. It was necessary to make an analysis of why. to know how the man had come to such extremes, and above all, to explain what it was that made the caretakers not understand the question. Master Augustus was assigned the task of making the analysis, which should be presented at the next board meeting, to be held in 4 months. Dear brothers, dearest President, these are the conclusions I have reached after deep meditation. The time set for me to perform this monumental task was too short, so the analysis still suffers from some obscure points. However, there are others that have enough clarity to be presented here. The typical pre-war German family was characterized by authoritarianism. The father decided everything, from mealtimes to the political party whose ideology the children and wife had to accept. The structure underpinning the relationships between family members was based on the idea that everyone had a role to which he or she had to conform. Thus, the father was the one who had to order all important matters. The wife had to abide by the husband's decisions, and the children had to continue the family tradition. Any manifestation that departed from what was expected according to one's role was punished with contempt and animosity. On the other hand, exaggeration of the role was rewarded in every possible way. If the structure said that the daughters should be submissive, sweet and obedient, and one of them was more submissive, sweeter, and more obedient than normal, her behavior was considered the most dignified, acceptable, and appropriate. Within many families, there were clear signs of competition to conform more orthodoxly to assigned roles. This was seen most frequently between daughters and sons. The competition was for greater acceptance by that member of the family who represented authority, i.e., the father. This desire to be accepted by authority can be explained as follows. Living playing a role means only self-deception. The person becomes the role and ceases to be himself, since being oneself is a necessity, and the role is only the appearance of being oneself. The agreement is created that someone will maintain and validate the role in exchange for submission. On some occasions, a family member might attempt to stop relying on the structure, and thus step out of his or her role. In that case, the other members would consider him to have strayed from the path, and would therefore try to reintroduce him to the structure. The person thus managed could fall into the ultimate insecurity, since he began to think that he was doing something very wrong, but at the same time felt that returning to the structure meant being very unhappy. He thought that everyone wished for his return, since they showed great concern, which on the surface was genuine, but it was nothing more than emotional blackmail aimed at giving more reality to the structure that someone was calling into question. The result of all this is that those who left the structure returned to it, driven by a feeling of guilt that they could not overcome. Exactly the same situation applied to the father, albeit on a more general level. He was pressured to accept the structure because that is what the society around him demanded, and moreover, he considered it to be the only appropriate and safe thing to do. Since no one in the family lived a true inner reality, everyone became an automaton safeguarding the structure imposed on them. Intra- and interfamily relationships were governed by a series of unspoken agreements that were characterized by giving and receiving the assurance that one was being authentic. These agreements were never questioned, for the simple reason that they did not know they existed. The 3 concentration camp caretakers came from families like those described. Each of them experienced in their childhood and adolescence an assigned and imposed role and all the agreements that emerged from it. They blindly accepted the structure of submission because they were convinced that it, and the roles ascribed to them, were the only thing that would lead them to be themselves. Of course, the whole situation described above was based on a deep inner insecurity and the no less deep certainty that what everyone around them considered to be true was really true. The reality of things is that in that situation, no one was himself. They only believed themselves to be what others defined as desirable, and therefore no one questioned the validity of what was thus defined. Hitler's rise to power, and all the leadership associated with it, was a logical and predictable event. Hitler gave the authority structure a mystical and grandiose character. People who only knew how to live roles saw themselves doing the most valuable thing to which a human being can aspire. Hitler gave them security in their deep insecurity, and this made the nascent leadership acquire an enormous strength. The basis of this apparent security was the agreement shared by all about their superiority over all other races. A cool April morning. The atmosphere is clean and clear. The Rhine flows placidly through the fields, and the sound of its cascades and streams is heard throughout the youth camp. In the middle of the valley, a series of tents stand in a semicircle around a flagpole. The swastika cloth is at the top, and the wind coming from the south makes it move. Karina, the oldest of the three friends, wakes up and stretches out her arms. The tent is illuminated by an amber light, and the fresh mountain air and the sound of the Rhine penetrate through the canvas of the walls and ceiling. It is a beautiful morning. There are 10 minutes left before the bugle sounds to signal the time to get up for the daily training. Karina's two friends are still asleep on their cots. Helia is very beautiful. Everyone admires her blonde, slender type, and she is sometimes shown by the supervisors as an example of what the Aryan race of the future could be. Yuzha, on the other hand, has a very unpleasant type. Brunette, plump and dark-eyed. Fellow trainees have sometimes even said that she looks like a beanstalk. This annoys Karina greatly. She agrees that Yuzha is not very Aryan. But to say that she looks like a Jewess, that's the last straw. Just yesterday, she got into a fight with Hans because of that. The truth is that she didn't think she could be so aggressive when someone made her angry, but Hans deserved it. It was very nice to get up before the bugle call and think about what they had learned the day before. Yesterday morning, the supervisor had taken them to a cave and made love to the three of them, which, she said, showed the ability and strength of a member of the Hitler Youth. It had been a great experience. The greatest thing had been that cry of Heil Hitler at the moment of the common orgasm. At noon, they had gone to admire the beauty of the glen, and as usual, they had had to butcher with their own hands the rabbit that they had caught alive, and would serve as food. To be able to do this, said the supervisor, is a mystical experience of strength and fortitude. It was a little pitiful to see that rabbit writhing in pain, but it was a great joy to be able to overcome the useless feelings of pity aroused by that inferior animal. After lunch, they had received their afternoon class. Yesterday, they reviewed German history after the First World War. It was not possible to understand the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles except by knowing that a Jewish dog had participated in its drafting. How he hated them. They were the cause of all the evils that the mother country suffered, and all because of their damned desire for money and power. They were inferior to that rabbit they had butchered. In the evening they had gathered around the fire and had sung. It was very exciting to feel like builders of the future empire. Never in the life of any nation had a youth been luckier. It was very beautiful to have been born in the same era as Adolf. Karina turned to see if anyone had heard that thought. She felt ashamed to call him by his first name, but it was that. She loved him so much. It was 2 minutes to the bugle call. Karina looked at her watch and suddenly began to feel anxious. In a week's time, the selection test will be held, and everyone wishes to take the top spots. The highest honor is to be selected to go to the camps. The dormitory they had been assigned was not altogether unpleasant. The beds were soft and the food good. The three friends were anxious to get to work. Everything was as they had imagined it would be, except for that foul smell. It was really something to be angry about. Even in those circumstances, the Jewish dogs could not stop taking revenge and making filth. In the evening, after receiving instructions, they went to the common dining room. It was delightful to listen to the stories told by the veteran caretakers. One of them was the center of everyone's attention. It is absolutely unbelievable the level of degradation these subhumans can reach. Even a pig takes care of its offspring, but they are capable of murdering their children. The story is true, I swear to you. They found in a basement in Warsaw a Jewish woman hanging her baby with her own hands. Karina felt very good. It was really necessary to finish them all off. Otherwise, the ideal society they so longed for would never be built. The smoke from the fires covered the whole city. Inside the walls, everything was ruin. The group of soldiers searched. The dogs sniffed and sniffed. The basement was full. Everyone heard the steps of the soldiers and the panting of the dogs. No one dared to breathe. Malka held her baby, begging the sky not to start crying. She hugged him, trying to comfort his hunger. The two wide eyes looked at his mother. 2 hours had already passed. The tension was unbearable. Sweaty bodies were trying to satisfy their thirst for oxygen with that rarefied air. The baby began to whimper. Everyone looked at Malka with frightened eyes. She hugged her son and caressed him in silence. The child was going to cry. In 2 seconds he was going to start crying. Malka knew it. She had to love him more, comfort him more. She placed the little face against her chest and hugged him desperately. The child calmed down. He was not going to cry anymore. Never again. Master Augustus paused. He could not continue. He looked at his brothers, and with an excited voice said, "We must prevent something similar from happening again, knowing that the human being has a mechanism that blocks a reality when it opposes a structure based on agreements, will make that at least none of us will be fooled." The rectory building was the pride of the city. Its 25 stories and the gigantic shield hanging from its panoramic tower were the first thing Augustus saw when he got off the plane. As usual, Angelicus, his driver, was waiting for him next to the limousine. Augustus greeted him and sat in the back seat. Angelicus admired Master Augustus very much. Everyone knew that the university was his work and that he would continue in it until the moment he died. Augustus felt very satisfied with himself. It had cost him 40 years of his life to make the university be considered one of the best in the world. No one knew better than him the sacrifices that this had implied, and now was the moment when he could rest. However, the construction of the Seminary of Human Studies was still pending. It was a grandiose enterprise, as much as the sum necessary to build it. Augustus had visited all the foundations in the country, but none of them was interested enough to finance the works. He would have to find a solution. Pilar, Augustus' private secretary, passed him the phone call. It was the Minister of Internal Affairs of the nation. "Dear Augustus, we have learned of your interest in creating a human studies seminar, and we are willing to collaborate in its realization." Augustus could not believe his ears. He had always considered the minister as someone disinterested in the university, and lo and behold, he was the one who would solve his problem. He realized that the minister had not finished speaking. "All we ask in return is a statement from you, supporting the political measures our government has put in place to safeguard the tranquility of the country." Augustus knew he would have to answer right then and there. He would have his seminar in exchange for a public statement. The political measures to reassure the country were not so bad after all. It is true that they restricted some minor liberties, but that was only temporary and would not cause any harm. His seminar, political statement, his seminar, the university, his work. "I agree, Minister." Augustus had not lost the habit of lecturing. Every Wednesday at 9 o'clock in the morning, the central auditorium of the university was set aside for this lecture. There was not enough room in the auditorium for all the students who were interested in listening to Augustus. Augustus adjusted his glasses and began his lecture. "Today I will talk about the baneful effects that result from the establishment of agreements and the difficulty of the human being to realize the existence of them." Augustus did not feel well. Something inside him snapped. Master Augustus began to be a spectator of Master Augustus. Part 2 Comments. First, on perception. Perception is an internal process. An object is perceived when it activates our brain structures, hence it is that central activation that gives rise to our experience of the object. The physical characteristics of the stimuli are less important than the way they activate our nervous system. This explains why the same stimulus can be perceived in very different ways. A few examples will suffice to explain this. If a subject is subjected to hypnosis, and in that state it is suggested to him that the ember of a burning cigarette is going to be put in contact with his skin, the subject will feel pain and will perceive that he has been burned, even though the object in contact has been a pencil or a chalk. The chalk or pencil was transformed by the subject's brain into a burning cigarette, and this is what he perceived, regardless of the physical characteristics of those. If a subject is presented with an ambiguous figure, and before stimulating him with it, he is warned that he will be shown a bird, it is very likely that in his brain, the ambiguous figure is transformed into a bird and is perceived as such. Again, this indicates that the perceptual process is constructive and internal, and not reconstructive and external. In fact, it is not necessary to resort to hypnosis processes or to use ambiguous figures to demonstrate the above. Any object that is presented to us does not exist for us, except insofar as it is capable of activating our brain. This activation changes, depending on the type and number of situations associated with the object, so that the perception of an object is inseparable from the memories associated with it. When we identify something, it is because that something has activated a store of memories. The brain activity resulting from the physical characteristics of the object is always combined with the brain activity associated with the memory store that the object has activated. If perception is the result of an internal activation, then nothing really exists externally. If we see a tree, it is because it has been built in our brain. If we dream about it, it has also been formed there. If we hallucinate it, it is because of the same thing. If the only real thing is the internal activation, then both perception and dream and hallucination are real. The only difference between them is that we assume that the physical tree can be shared, while the dream and the hallucination cannot. Sharing the physical tree implies assuming that it gives rise to the same type of brain activation in many observers, as if such activation were a linear reconstruction of the tree. The truth is quite different. The tree can be perceived differently by different observers, depending on the type of experiences with which each of them associates it. Therefore, to suppose that it is being shared is erroneous. The only thing that is shared is the assumption that it is shared. The most tragic thing is that as a result of the above, an evaluative mechanism of realities is developed. This mechanism considers as real any experience that can be shared with others, and thus invalidates a series of internal experiences, on the basis that they cannot be shared. The paradox is that this mechanism does not realize that the experience resulting from the perception of a physical object cannot be shared either. The only thing that results from all this farce is a state of confusion in which it is thought that what is valid and real is what is manifested, and that this manifestation gives rise to and results from a shareable internal experience. Hence the emphasis on the behavioral manifestation of a process, since it is considered to be the only real thing, and the disdain for the internal processes, since they are considered unreal and invalid. This structure of emphasis and disdain explains why interacting with a person almost always involves a management of appearances and agreements, and rarely an exchange of internal experiences. Many of our habits are a direct reflection of the above. We follow a fashion for dressing. We live in houses whose size and luxury are disproportionate. We use pompous expressions. We assign roles and roles to ourselves. We establish legal and commercial agreements. We are interested in money and power. We seek the approval of others, etc. It is only when we realize that everything is internal that we begin to be. When this happens, we will have the absolute certainty that sharing an idea, thought, or feeling does not make them more real or valid, but that they are valid and real by themselves. Furthermore, we will understand that the structure according to which an internal experience only has value and reality when it is shared results from a posticious transference of the other structure that asserts that a physical event is real on condition that many observers agree on it. Second, games. To play is to use the other to obtain personal satisfaction, that is, to use him as an object. The motivation that drives someone to play is the desire to obtain the approval of the person to whom the game is directed. This use of the other for approval is only possible when the behaviors or ideas associated with the game are a sham. The person who needs approval for his or her actions plays that they are real without realizing that the fact that they require approval only means that they are not. The persistence of the games can be explained if we take into account that they are a defense used to prevent the other from penetrating into the interior of the one who plays. The fear we have of the other finding out that we are insecure and unhappy makes us play at being secure and happy. We think that putting up an impenetrable barrier to the other's entrance solves the problem, but it only aggravates it. We are so afraid of showing what we really are that we play at showing the exact opposite of what we are. We think that showing our reality will only lead us to be rejected. But the most dramatic thing is that we consider that manifesting the opposite of who we are is going to make us change. If only we could accept ourselves, all the games would disappear. We could establish relationships based on love and not on use. Our inability to do so is determined by our idea that we are the only ones playing games. If we were to ask others, we would know that they play games too, and that, like us, they want to stop. We accept the games of others so that they, in turn, will accept ours. But this leads to nothing but unhappiness and farce. The only thing that can truly lead us to happiness is that which brings us closer to our inner self, that is, the self. The only way to find out is not to accept our own games or those of others, forcing ourselves to stop playing them. The moment we begin to do so, we will realize how much we had not learned when we were playing, and how wonderful the world is now without games. Third, of reality and games. In our scale of values, the most important thing is the external manifestation of any event. We consider that what is real is what happens on the outside. The movement of a flower is real as long as it causes some change in another flower, in the air around it, or in the place where it falls. Someone is real as long as he emits sounds that can be detected, moves, or hits us. The other is real as long as he has some behavior that relates him to me. Even I myself am real only if I manage to provoke a change in the other. The universe is real as long as it is a whole outside myself. Our dreams are not real since they are not directly associated with events that bring about change in others. That is what we have been taught. It is something that everyone agrees on, and therefore cannot be disputed. The truth of things is very different, and generally we cannot see it because of its extreme simplicity. When I see a flower move, both the movement and the flower are built within me. The flower is for me as long as I perceive it. The universe exists as long as I can understand it. To say that it exists outside of me even though I do not understand it only serves a game. I can really communicate with someone only when that someone is inside me and is equal to me. At that moment, it is not necessary for that someone to emit sounds. Since he is inside me, I can know him. The flower I saw yesterday made me feel its sex. It was a bright center full of stars, and from it rose erect pistils, expectant of pollen. That transmission and that feeling could only have happened if the flower was previously in me. I built the flower and I felt it, and that is the real thing, even if it does not cause movement or strike. When we begin to realize that everything is in us, we are able to modify, build, and alter. The window, the door, and the stars are only conceivable and knowable when they activate our brain. Therefore, the only real thing is that activation, since its absence leads to nothingness. The whole universe is within me, hence it depends on my construction and is my effect. We can communicate with someone only when we are both inside each other. Therefore, when this condition is fulfilled, words are no longer necessary. We are the creators of creation, and because of this, no question we ask will be invalid. I felt the sex of the flower. I knew that the flower was inside me, for only in that way could it transmit its sex to me. I understood that the whole universe is in myself, and that is why I can do whatever I wish in it. I can fly and be a star. I realized that I could communicate without words, and although this astonished me, I understood that it was simple, since if everything, including the other, is in myself, there is nothing easier than to communicate with him. I knew that what I see and what I feel is when I am myself. I understood that I could ask and answer any question, being that in this way I was not harming, but on the contrary, I was edifying. I knew that I am more valuable than any game and that I am free. I understood that I could no longer go back, that although difficult, this is the only valid and real thing. I understood that if I can be completely me and absolutely free of my games, I will understand the whole universe and transmit the whole universe. What I learned yesterday is that there is more inside me than I ever imagined. For someone to begin to be himself, it is necessary for him to live different stages. First, he must understand that there are games. Then, to know that he plays them because he has been taught that they are valuable. He must know that this value is given and arises from the insecurity of the other, his need to establish an agreement with us, to give shared reality to a commitment, that this need to share is born from his own insecurity. The idea that reality is outside of us. Further on, it must destroy the whole history of shared agreements and structures. And above all things, it must feel that it is more valuable than any game, because in it is the whole universe. If we succeed, we will be, and if we are, we will be able to see and learn. We will be responsible for our decisions. We will not play, and all fears and anxieties will disappear. Third, of reality and games. In our scale of values, the most important thing is the external manifestation of any event. We consider that what is real is what happens on the outside. The movement of a flower is real as long as it causes some change in another flower, in the air around it, or in the place where it falls. Someone is real as long as he emits sounds that can be detected, moves, or hits us. The other is real as long as he has some behavior that relates him to me. Even I myself am real only if I manage to provoke a change in the other. The universe is real as long as it is a whole outside myself. Our dreams are not real since they are not directly associated with events that bring about change in others. That is what we have been taught. It is something that everyone agrees on, and therefore cannot be disputed. The truth of things is very different, and generally we cannot see it because of its extreme simplicity. When I see a flower move, both the movement and the flower are built within me. The flower is for me as long as I perceive it. The universe exists as long as I can understand it. To say that it exists outside of me even though I do not understand it only serves a game. I can really communicate with someone only when that someone is inside me and is equal to me. At that moment, it is not necessary for that someone to emit sounds. Since he is inside me, I can know him. The flower I saw yesterday made me feel its sex. It was a bright center full of stars, and from it rose erect pistils, expectant of pollen. That transmission and that feeling could only have happened if the flower was previously in me. I built the flower and I felt it, and that is the real thing even if it does not cause movement or strike. When we begin to realize that everything is in us, we are able to modify, build, and alter. The window, the door, and the stars are only conceivable and knowable when they activate our brain. Therefore, the only real thing is that activation, since its absence leads to nothingness. The whole universe is within me, hence it depends on my construction and is my effect. We can communicate with someone only when we are both inside each other. Therefore, when this condition is fulfilled, words are no longer necessary. We are the creators of creation, and because of this, no question we ask will be invalid. I felt the sex of the flower. I knew that the flower was inside me, for only in that way could it transmit its sex to me. I understood that the whole universe is in myself, and that is why I can do whatever I wish in it. I can fly and be a star. I realized that I could communicate without words, and although this astonished me, I understood that it was simple, since if everything, including the other, is in myself, there is nothing easier than to communicate with him. I knew that what I see and what I feel is when I am myself. I understood that I could ask and answer any question, being that in this way I was not harming, but on the contrary, I was edifying. I knew that I am more valuable than any game and that I am free. I understood that I could no longer go back, that although difficult, this is the only valid and real thing. I understood that if I can be completely me and absolutely free of my games, I will understand the whole universe and transmit the whole universe. What I learned yesterday is that there is more inside me than I ever imagined. For someone to begin to be himself, it is necessary for him to live different stages. First, he must understand that there are games. Then, to know that he plays them because he has been taught that they are valuable. He must know that this value is given and arises from the insecurity of the other, his need to establish an agreement with us, to give shared reality to a commitment, that this need to share is born from his own insecurity. The idea that reality is outside of us. Further on, it must destroy the whole history of shared agreements and structures. And above all things, it must feel that it is more valuable than any game, because in it is the whole universe. If we succeed, we will be, and if we are, we will be able to see and learn. We will be responsible for our decisions. We will not play, and all fears and anxieties will disappear. Fourth, of the decider of realities. We possess a pontifical mechanism and decider of realities. We decide beforehand and without any doubt that a dream is not real, but that the vision of a bridge on a foggy day is real. The decision that something is real does not depend on the clarity with which its image appears. The events during the dream may be sharper than the vision of the bridge. nor does it depend on the time of occurrence or the geographical location. The strangest thing is that it does not depend on the presence or absence of the object. The bridge may have disappeared, and yet we decide that it is still real. An optical illusion may be present, and yet we decide that it is unreal. This should lead us to the conclusion that the real and the unreal exist only as a construction, and that the true reality is within us. However, we do not deem it so. What is it, then, that makes the pontifical mechanism make a judgment of reality? Undoubtedly, it is the other introjected in oneself. Whether a child wakes up in the night crying because of an unpleasant dream, or wakes up laughing because of a wonderful dream, the other always tells him, "What happened to you is not real. The only real thing is what I consider to be real." Thus, the child begins to doubt and ends up admitting it. In some tribal societies this does not happen. The pontifical mechanism is not created with the strength it has among us. This perhaps explains the faculty of imagination and eidetic memory that they have and that we have lost. For them, the real is the internal. For us, the external. We question their realities and they question ours. The conviction is of both, and therefore it is not the determinant of reality, but it does prescribe the decisions of the pontifical mechanism. When we have the conviction that reality is that which the other shares, it is the other who determines the decisions of the pontifical mechanism. It is the other who alone makes us decide whether a dream is reality or not. It is never us. If it were, we would consider the dream as real as the vision of the bridge. The extraordinarily incongruous thing is that both the vision of the bridge and the dream only occur in us, yet one is shared and the other is not, and that is what makes us ultimately decide. It is the ultimate of dependencies, the ultimate of self-forgetfulness. This is the origin of games and constructions. We depend on what the other considers adequate, when what determines what is adequate is the agreement with the other. Construction is necessary when the pontifical mechanism decides that the basis and only reality is that which is shared, that the raison d'etre of reality is agreement. It is clear the need we have to establish agreements, since the other, by sharing a consideration, makes it as real as the bridge. What happens inside us is not real as long as the other does not approve and share it. This means that inside us it may or may not be real. Even more, it may at times be real, and the next moment, depending on whether the other has repented of sharing, it may cease to be so. The pontifical mechanism is nothing but a hypocrite, and yet we depend on its decisions. If we could see ourselves in the absence of agreements, everything would be real. Instead, with agreements, everything is real and at the same time unreal. It is a farce and a game. If we could at least respect ourselves, we would put an end to deceit. We would stop needing games and impositions. We could live free, certain that we are responsible for reality and the cause of it. We would realize that making our reality depend on that of the other, and that at the same time the reality of the other depends on ours, is nothing more than a farce. Hence, constructs are not real. They are only a substitute for the forgotten ability to trust ourselves. In other words, since internal reality exists only when it is shared, we substitute in an acrobatic act the contradiction of accepting something internal as real by transforming it into something external and shared that can no longer be questioned as unreal. We do not realize that at the same time that we discard the internal as unreal, we have the absolute necessity to live in it, and as we do not dare to accept it by itself, we need to share it so that it becomes real and therefore acceptable. We are naive and at the same time ingenious. The conflict that would represent deciding to accept the reality of our inner self, we entrust and transfer it in an act of supreme audacity and hypocrisy to the decision of the other, and the other does the same with us. Only in this way do we feel confident that we have not fallen into a contradiction, being that in reality it is so, and in the most consummate form. Since the conflict has disappeared and we have discarded the contradiction and the incongruity, we feel able to judge when someone is outside or inside reality, when someone is or is not sick, when what we judge is the need of the one we consider sick to share his inner reality. The truth of the matter is that we are the sick ones. The one we categorize as sick accepts his reality, our reality. We accept and reject it at the same time. We accept it because we need the other to accept it. We reject it for exactly the same reason. We are afraid to decide for ourselves and to get closer to ourselves because we believe we are incapable of doing without the other. But at the same time, we cannot do without an inner reality. The solution we find is to simultaneously accept and reject ourselves. What makes us reach such an absurd compromise is the lack of respect we have for ourselves. But we have to understand that this lack of respect was imposed by someone who did not respect himself either, by someone who needed to share his insecurity with us. Sometimes we forget this, and we begin to doubt things that are obvious and ourselves. We think that we are nothing, that we are worthless, that we need agreements, that these are acceptable and valuable, that our reality only exists when the other accepts it. We forget that even forgetting ourselves, we are the creators of forgetfulness. Fifth, physical reality. If there is a physical reality external to us, it is of no importance as long as we do not learn something from it. We can be presented with any object, and if we observe it only without it causing any change in us, the object itself and the relation to it are nothing more than a nullity, and therefore do not exist in reality. To consider that they exist in their state of nullity means nothing more than to settle for a situation of agreement and to cease to respect ourselves. All our lives we have been surrounded by millions of visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, etc. stimuli, each of which could represent an extraordinary teaching about the entire universe. However, in our blindness and dullness we are content to be passively stimulated without learning, without realizing the wonder that surrounds us. The stimulus may or may not be physical. That does not matter. What is fundamental is the way in which that stimulus is constructed in ourselves. Sixth, structures and agreements. Someone, at some point in a person's life, had the need to establish an agreement with him. If it achieves its objective, it ceases to be. The acceptance of the imposed agreement makes one lose, from that moment on, the capacity to realize that one can modify reality. The agreement implies the exchange of apparent assurances that are nothing more than insecurities. When someone is insecure, he needs to establish by any means an agreement that strengthens and gives reality to his structure. The structure and the agreements emanating from it become so powerful and strong that one begins to depend on them. From that moment on, the only thing that matters is to safeguard the structure, without thinking that this implies sacrificing the self. When a child is put in contact with someone who needs to impose structures and thinks he knows the way, the child naturally resists. Through continuous emotional blackmail, "I love you as long as you accept my structure," the child falls into the trap. He begins to get the feeling that the only thing that matters and is worth taking seriously is the structure. His thoughts, desires, decisions, and feelings do not matter. It is only important to defend the structure, not because it has a value in itself, but because otherwise the child is rejected and no one accepts him. Only if I agree with you do you love me. Therefore only then am I worth anything, otherwise I am nothing. It becomes necessary to be in contact with someone who appears to be, since he maintains and defends the structure, in order to feel value. Little by little, all sense of security is lost. The only thing that is done is to depend on those who hold structures. If the process is completed, which almost always happens, the child loses all possibility of feeling. He believes that it is only important to manifest the behaviors associated with feeling. Since I am worth as long as you accept me and love me, I have to manifest openly what you expect from me. It does not matter if I feel it or not. It only matters that you are sure that I am part of your structure, and therefore my behavior must manifest what I believe you want me to manifest. At that point, all possibility of communication begins to be lost. Everyone begins to agree, although the only thing that really happens is that everyone plays at agreeing. Since no one is interested in questioning the structures, everything becomes redundant. In addition to losing the possibility of communication, the ability to learn is lost. That is, the structures have a limit beyond which they become circular. Everything must be included in the circle, and therefore nothing teaches, and nothing new happens. There is a great attraction towards people who decide because it is believed that they are the only ones who are worth, since they give value. All the others are in a state of conclusion, of hopeless goal, and have no value. In this circumstance, it is not possible to see absolutely nothing. Everything that surrounds the subject must be included in the structure. If by its nature it is not possible to include it, then it is discarded. The games that are played are nothing other than the desire to make the other feel that one is capable of being. It does not matter whether one really is or not. The only thing that matters is to convince the other. The others are always more important and valuable than the self, since they decide when one is being, that being means being part of the structure. At the same time, the person becomes the most important thing, since she is always sure that others are only observing and watching her, when in reality the only thing the other is interested in is to safeguard her own structure. The process of internalizing the other has been completed, and it no longer matters what the other is or is not thinking. There is only the feeling that the other, in oneself, is observing, judging, and evaluating. Structures are multiple and almost always too subtle to be easily recognized. Concepts such as time, reality, importance, happiness, independence, freedom can become structures. Practically in that state of dependence, everything is structure, since it does not exist in reality and externally, but has been artificially constructed in oneself. One is the one who ultimately gives reality to a structure by depending on it. When the structure is subtle enough, it is extremely difficult not only to get out of it, but above all, to realize that it exists. This is due to the inability to see oneself from outside the structure. On the other hand, living within a structure gives a sense of security and well-being. Since the other is in oneself, one is not insecure as long as one does, thinks, and feels what one believes the other wants from oneself. I feel good since the other in myself cannot reproach me for anything. The problem is that if one has always lived inside, one does not know or have the slightest idea of what is advocated as ideal. One speaks of happiness, although in reality one does not know it, and one does not know it for the simple reason that one thinks that one is not valuable. One speaks of well-being, freedom, independence, security, etc., although in reality one has no idea of what they mean. One only knows or thinks one knows which are the behaviors that the other, in oneself, identifies as a manifestation of the above. What is of interest and the only thing one knows is the motor or verbal manifestation. It is known that this is sufficient since the manifestation is the only thing that the other can perceive. As it depends on the perception of the manifested behavior, nothing else is of concern. Everything is unreal, since everything is a game. One plays to be happy, one plays to be independent, one plays to be free, although one does not have the slightest idea of what all this means. Meanings are sought, and paths are sought without realizing that they will never be found if one has a preconceived idea of how they should be. One is not capable of looking outside the structure, that is, in oneself. You want someone to guide you, because that is the only thing you have learned. But strangely enough, one remains. The proof of this is that there is depression and searching. It is customary to blame the outside for one's own problems, because one cannot conceive that everything results from a reality that one desperately tries to preserve. When there is a feeling of discomfort, it is explained by finding someone or something that has done harm. When the feeling is one of well-being, one thanks someone or something outside for the gift. One does not trust or even think that when one feels discomfort, when something depresses, it is only a warning that says, "You fell back into the structure. You are sure that you can never be sure. You know that you cannot know." It is believed that feeling completely happy is a utopia, and therefore it is. One assures oneself that there is an external reality, and forgets that reality exists only in oneself. The world depends on us and not us on it, for the simple reason that we are the ones who build it. It is thought that knowledge is data, and it is forgotten that the only knowledge is that which arises from oneself, and that no one is to blame, and no one can really change more than oneself. We live in a continuous past without realizing that living it is only now and today. The past exists only in the present moment in which it is remembered, therefore it does not have its own separate existence. It is only when it is thought of, and this only happens now. One thinks that time exists and forgets that it is nothing more than an invention. It is considered that the most important thing is to develop an activity, and it is forgotten that the activity does not matter, that what matters is the way it is performed. One is sure that there is a path that will lead to a goal, when in reality there is neither path nor goal. There is only one being, and he/she does not need to prepare himself/herself. He/she is here at this moment. One thinks that a change will come, and that the future will solve the problems, or the opposite. One assures oneself that the past was better, when in reality the solution is always present in oneself, and at this precise moment. And above all, there is a terrible fear of changing things, because one thinks that nothing will remain, when in reality there is being on the other side. The feeling of fear of remaining empty is what often perpetuates the structure. The fear is so intense that you want others to share ideas, agreements, and structures, because only then will you have something. Is change possible? Definitely yes. It all depends on creating the conditions to, at least for a moment, live a different reality. If someone has the good fortune to live at least for a moment a different reality, and if that someone has the capacity to remember that moment, then he or she is already halfway there. From that moment on, he will never be satisfied with being inside the structure, since he already knows, he has remembered it, that there is something outside it. He has a point of reference. At that moment, everything begins to change. You begin to detect things that are always associated with an annoying state. One begins to trust that when there is discomfort, it is because there is a departure from the instant of being. Then a struggle begins. Everything that moves away from what has been felt is questioned. Everything that brings us closer is strengthened. One begins to understand that many concepts were only theoretical, that they were not really felt, learned, or lived, and from that moment on, nothing is left behind. All sensation of dependence is questioned. The things that affect, depress, and cause pain are no longer accepted as a necessary evil. One begins to question and to fight. Since there has been a contact with the being, nothing can remain the same. One knows with certainty that there is something in oneself more important and valuable than any external structure. Things and events that used to be reinforcing begin to cease to be so. One needs less and less from the outside, and at the same time the outside becomes more pleasant. Little by little we stop blaming, pitying, and feeling sorry for ourselves. At the same time, the games of others are understood, and it becomes interesting to stop playing them, because just as we have found out that we are more valuable than the games we are used to playing, in the same way we know that others are more valuable than the games they try to impose. One does not accuse or have the sensation of being attacked or disillusioned. One is only interested in being, and that the others are themselves as well. Since an internal recognition begins, and one begins to recognize others as healthy, good, and valuable as oneself, the feeling or fear of not agreeing begins to disappear. The structure and agreements that were previously defended and manifested in the interrelationships, that is, in the games, cease to drive. It is known that they were only a defense or a mask, and that it is no longer necessary to use them for there to be approval, since this approval and the demonstration that one is capable and valuable are no longer of interest. Before, one believed to be very important, one knew that others only thought of oneself. That is why one played. Now one recognizes that one is not so important, and at the same time one begins to feel admiration for oneself. That is to say, you are part of the universe, and that is something that teaches you. You admire it, and you begin to understand that others are also part of the universe. That is why you begin to love and admire them. Before you loved others and yourself only when you gave and received approval. Now you know that no one is really when he is part of the agreement, but rather when he is himself. One begins to have the feeling that one is a cause and not only an effect. Games are no longer satisfying. One only accepts to be. At the beginning of the change, strange things often happen. Sometimes you feel that there is a kind of magic around you, that you are able to perceive things and to do and feel things that before only existed as theory. You begin to understand that reality depends on being. One knows that change exists and that it does not depend on change in the outside or in others, but only in oneself. One begins to discard the past and personal history. One understands that the past only exists when it is considered as the most important thing. It is discovered that the ages that have been lived are in the now, and that everything converges in the present. One begins to be able to see the universe and discovers not only that it is marvelous, but that it means teaching. Any event is significant and important. Others begin to change. They are no longer seen as reflections and representatives of an internal structure. One begins to see them as separate entities and at the same time equal to oneself. Communication is established, since you no longer carry the heavy burden of structure. The others are like oneself. None of them is guilty or deserves compassion. One understands and sees oneself, since one no longer understands and sees everything as a simple reflection of the structure. Moreover, one enjoys, one is at ease, one no longer desires others as one's property, nor does one accept to be anyone's property. Above all, you know that there is being in everyone around you, and you begin to love. One is like others, not so much as subjected to a structure, but rather as possessors of a being that has no need of support, structure, or agreement. What is important ceases to matter. One knows that it is one's own invention and therefore depends on oneself. One begins to see everyone as gods, without limitations, without dependencies, without needs. Wonderful things begin to happen. You begin to discover. I discovered that time does not exist. I understood that everything is new. Halfway through, I realized that the past is in others. I lived that all ages and all times are present in any act or thought. I realized that to love someone is to see him fly, to let him be without possessing him, without making him or making me dependent. I knew that I am good, because others teach me. I know that the most valuable thing is to learn from oneself, that therein lies the source of knowledge, for I am part of and I am the whole universe. Seventh, of appearances. We like to be admired and validated by others. We think that this is normal and that there is no problem. We are not able to understand that this sensation of pleasure is based on the idea that what is real is what is manifested, that what is valuable depends on the acceptance of the other. We do not understand that this sensation arises from the feeling that we are nothing, that the only thing that matters is what one believes the other considers valuable, and since the other only sees the external manifestation, we have to adapt to it. We forget that reality is in us, that it depends on us, and that it does not arise or come from the acceptance of our manifestations. We do not realize that the pleasure we feel when we see ourselves admired by others is just another game we play, and that, in addition, it prevents us from being. We trust more in the criterion of the other than in our own, and the worst thing is that generally that criterion is nothing more than what we, in our structure, wish it to be. We can reach such a point in our blindness, and in our idea that the self of the other is what the other does, that we stop seeing the other as he is, and we only see in him his story. If he ever committed an attack against our structure, the other will be, from that moment on, an attack against our structure. He will never be anything else. If he ever made a mistake, he will be, from that moment on, a mistake. Since we all depend on the way the other perceives us in ourselves, what was said above also applies to ourselves. We can believe that we are a mistake or anything else, because that is how the other in oneself perceives us. In that way we consider ourselves and become an appearance, and the most serious thing is that this appearance we believe ourselves to be results in a set of behaviors and thoughts appropriate to that appearance. We believe ourselves to be what someone once saw in our history, and therefore, that is what we begin to be. Those kinds of beliefs are extremely difficult to discover in oneself. We live so imbued with them that nothing else exists for us. When something or someone makes us see it, we don't even reject it, we just don't understand it. Eighth, of assignment and evaluation. Someone can begin to leave the structure and its agreements. He can realize what these are, find out where they come from, and begin to discard them. However, this is not enough for him to reach being. It is necessary that on the way he does not yield to anything. When someone yields, he falls. It goes without saying that most of the time it is very easy to give in. We think that it will have no effect, that it will disappear and be forgotten, that it is something secondary and will no longer do any harm, that there are more important things than giving in to some trifle. This is false. It only derives from the idea that we are what we act and manifest. We do not realize that giving in implies establishing an agreement, and that this agreement remains and begins to generalize, ending with all the rest. The path to being is not easy when it is not. The thought that it is easy results from considering that the things to which we yield are unimportant, from not being responsible for our decisions, and above all, from the belief that by doing so we will not be affected. Moreover, during the abandonment of the structure, there is the danger of falling into the ultimate dependency, needing the other to determine our independence, that is, to depend on the other's view of our own independence. This is the most subtle dependence, the most difficult to see and therefore to correct. However, it is in no way different from living within a structure, since it constitutes in itself a new structure. In this case, and above all things, we become interested in getting out of the structure and the agreements we have established. such interest becomes so extreme that all we do in trying to get out is only trying to get out, and that prevents us from being. The thoughts and acts we develop begin to be evaluated, and we become spectators of them. This prevents us from living and feeling them. Being a spectator of oneself is a real calamity. We begin to think that we are when in reality we only evaluate what we do. Possibly, the evaluation no longer depends so much on others but on ourselves, and this, in the end, results in the same thing. To be implies subtracting oneself from all evaluation without worrying about it. When this concern is reborn, we fall back into a structure that consists of defending ourselves and denying all structure. In other words, we are only when we stop thinking that we are. We are only when we manage to remove ourselves from the concern for being, and to achieve this there is no recipe or path. When we believe that there is, we will automatically fall into a new structure. We will see ourselves being, and that ends all possibility of being, since it is in itself a contradiction. Ninth, of the goals. We are so accustomed to think that reality is the overt and behavioral manifestation, and at the same time to consider that our thoughts and desires exist only as subordinate to that external reality, that sometimes it seems to us the simplest thing to separate the two. Thus, we may have a desire at a given moment. If for some reason it does not fit into the structure we defend, then we inhibit its realization. We think that it is worthless and does not exist as long as it does not manifest itself. We act as if what we desire does not exist. We deny in our behavior this interior because we are convinced that it is inadequate, and we do not realize that we are simply playing. In our verbalizations we reach theoretical levels that, according to our structure, are the goal and the ideal, even when what we feel does not correspond to it. At times it would seem that what we understand by goal and ideal is simply the result of denying what we feel, because we consider it inadequate. The truth is that we are simply playing at being outside the structure, and we have never been more inside it than in those moments when we deny ourselves. We begin to depend on the idea of independence, and we adapt our actions and thoughts to it. We become spectators of it and of ourselves. Only rarely do we become aware of this subtle game. We are distressed at how far away real change seems to be. On those occasions we see the contradiction and decide to stop living in it. However, that is not enough. We have simply fallen into another structure, that of decisions and willpower. We decide that from that moment on there will be no separation, that we will do what we feel without asking whether it is adequate or not, and we believe that with that decision we will solve the incongruence. But the truth is that this incongruity remains. It forces us and determines us. It is necessary to try again, to recognize that reality is within us, and to give rise to change. This knowledge must be real. The other will not transmit certainty to us. Only we ourselves can know it. We should not ask or expect the other to let us know. And yet our way of testing and our way of knowing, at that stage, are always through the other, always the other. Thus we reach an impasse, a dead end, a redundant circle. Something must happen. It is necessary to start again, to try again. 10th, Interdependencies. Curious things happen when one is not. Since the other determines and validates what I am, and the other feels, decides, and does not play, in my relations with him, I must do everything possible so that my conduct satisfies him, fills him and pleases him. It does not matter that I do not really feel. The important thing is that the other is well, because that is what will lead me to think that I am capable. That is to say, if I achieve that the other is satisfied with me, I will be more valuable, since I will be the cause of his well-being. The curious thing is that the other may have the same type of structure as I do. That is, he may care more about making me feel good or showing me the way, since that validates him. This leads to the ultimate incongruity. Each one in himself is only in relation to the thought that the other is, and the reality is that neither of us is. We only play at being, depending on the conviction that each one is making the other be. One expects the other to feel, the other expects one to feel, and no one feels. 11th of the roles. When we start an activity that we do not know, but of which we have a theoretical idea, we become the theoretical idea of that activity. In other words, we assume a role and begin to be that role. We feel it is more valuable to act according to what everyone, including ourselves, has defined as appropriate. And from that moment on, we begin to value our actions in the activity. If we feel something that we know does not fit the idea that others have of how the activity should be, we inhibit that feeling and act according to the theoretical idea. In that way, we fall into a circle in which the role is preserved not because we are in it, but because we depend on what we are expected to be. Whoever observes us reinforces his idea that the role is valuable, since he sees us acting in correspondence to it, and therefore increases his conviction that this role exists by itself and is something real. This, in turn, confers on us the same security, and therefore we have no doubt that it must be preserved. However, this only leads to nullity. We do not do what we feel, but we act by demonstrating to the other the apparent existence of that feeling, which is extremely paradoxical, for we consider the feeling important and act as if it existed, but simultaneously we inhibit any possibility of really feeling. We deceive ourselves in the most puerile and foolish way, and we do not realize the farce. 12th of the Teachings and the Impositions. We believe that we are more valuable when the other learns from us. If we have this structure, it means that what we are trying to teach is a theoretical idea. In essence, what we are doing is simply imposing the theoretical idea to make it acquire an apparent reality. If the other accepts the imposition, we will have the assurance that this idea is valuable and real, since the other also agrees with it. When that idea, which we wish to be accepted and shared by the other, refers to the need to be independent and stop living within structures, we fall into the most subtle farce. The need we have for the other to share the opinion that it is necessary to get out of the structure constitutes another structure that implies the same or worse dependence than the one we are apparently teaching to discard. This means that everything can become a structure, and that the structure does not have a reality of its own, but that we are always the ones who create it. We should limit ourselves to transmitting instead of wanting to teach, and we should transmit only that of which we are absolutely sure that it is not a theoretical idea. Otherwise, we will only be establishing an agreement that later becomes almost impossible to understand and, above all, to break. The need to impose a theoretical idea comes from the structure that considers that idea as more valuable than oneself. 13th of the future. Every action, thought, or sensation is the most important thing, since everything that exists only exists in this moment. It is only conceivable and explicable to do something which we know is in itself an imposition on the other, or results from an imposition of the other, when we have convinced ourselves that this something is not important, and we believe it is not important because we suppose it will bring no future effect. We believe that what is important and valuable will happen someday in the future, and that the acts of the present prepare that future. We think that in order to reach that future, we have to deprive ourselves of certain things, submit to certain impositions, and sacrifice certain acts, since if we do not make that sacrifice, we would cut the way. There is nothing more false, and the reason is very simple. The future does not exist, to think that there are unimportant acts, to consider that it is valid and prudent to prepare ourselves by sacrificing part of ourselves, only leads to one result: we will never be, we will have given up something, and nothing is or will be valuable. One would expect an elder to be himself, but that depends on whether every act of his life has been important or whether he has yielded. The old man who yielded must have the most distressing feeling, for he realizes that it did not lead him but to fear death. 14th of pain. Pain does not exist, except as a description and concept applicable to certain situations in which we believe it should manifest itself. This is an experience. I can control my pain, and this control is obtained when I realize that it is only a structure, when I estimate beforehand that certain situations are necessarily the cause of pain. They are. When, on the other hand, I am able to stop considering that I will necessarily feel pain, I stop feeling it. This is because in reality the pain is not outside me, but inside me. 15th, of the world and its descriptions. The world is a description. It seems to us the most fixed, immutable, and constant thing that exists, but this only results from the fact that we have been taught to consider it thus: fixed, immutable, and constant. If the world is constructed within us, then the world can change by changing the construction. We can build the world we want, but for this it is necessary to become completely sure, to stop asking ourselves questions, and to be absolutely certain that we are cause and not effect, that the world is in us and not outside. It is indispensable to have found the being. 16th, of concealments. Before the other we hide ourselves. We consider that it is not convenient to establish a relationship in which we open ourselves completely. It is better that the other has an image of me through my behavior. It is something extraordinary. We think that what exists within each one of us is useless. We are afraid to be before the other because we depend on the idea that the other may be disappointed, and that would imply our invalidity. However, we continue to think and feel, but we also hide it within ourselves, as if this concealment would mean that what is inside us would cease to be real. We think that by hiding we are erasing, and the truth is that by trying to deceive the other we only deceive ourselves. 17th, of wanting and possessing. Our culture has taught us that one really loves a person only when the need and the commitment to make that person a personal possession arise. We are used to hearing phrases like, "I want you for myself," "I can't live without you," etc. They prepare us to love a person as if he/she were an object. The truth of the matter is that loving in this sense is nothing more than the result of an insecurity. I love the other as long as the other loves me. In this condition, one does not love the other person, and even less oneself. One has doubts about one's own worth, and the only thing one wishes is that the other person, through his or her behavior, makes them disappear. We rely on a structure. What we believe we love is not the other, but rather that structure, and what we want from the other is simply that he/she does not question it, but rather, on the contrary, reinforces it. Therefore we are afraid that the other will cease to be our property. That would mean that he doubts the validity of our structure. In reality, to love a person is to be able to see him as separate from oneself, without possessing him, and without being his possession, without thinking that previously determined and structured events must occur. To love a person is to learn from him without having this as a motive. It is to let him be and to be oneself, but at the same time, we can love someone only when we love ourselves, for that someone is within us. The two should not be confused. Just because someone is within me does not mean that he or she is my complement or my property. It only means that I am already the one who wants, that wanting is within me and is not a structure that we wish to maintain or are afraid of losing. 18th, feelings of guilt. We have been taught not to say the things we feel, because it might cause harm to the other. This one may be immersed in games and appearances, and manifest an unalterable security. He may be a nullity of sensations and thoughts of his own, but as he appears to be, he must not be touched. We have been taught not to question appearances, to respect above all structures, to think that what is valuable is the apparent manifestation and not the inner reality. When in this situation we dare to question, we feel that we are doing harm. We are not able to understand that what we have dared to do means to start building. Rather, we fear that the result will be to bring the other into a state of discomfort. We care more about that discomfort than about getting the other out of his or her game. We consider that the game is more important than the being, and therefore, we feel that we do harm, and we believe we are guilty. The feeling of guilt is continuous and chronic. We should not doubt the structure, but simultaneously we doubt, and this makes us feel guilty. When someone has been taught that what is valuable is to manifest what the other considers adequate, that what he feels and what he is worthless because the other cannot perceive it, and that it is necessary to surround oneself with people who represent, in the purest possible way, the structures on which one depends, at that moment the way is prepared for the continuous and repeated appearance of feelings of guilt. We feel guilty when we question the structure. That feeling arises from questioning it, and from the fear that doing so will result in rejection of us, from the fear of being left with nothing. Since we are what the other sees in us, anything that deviates from the proper appearance will make us feel guilty, for we will cease to be. When one is and does what one feels, there is no room for feelings of guilt. In that state, it is impossible to feel guilty, for the simple reason that the dichotomy and the separation between manifesting and feeling disappear. 19th, of liberty. We have a great tendency to think that there is nothing new to learn, that the world has nothing more to teach us. In that state, we urgently need to surround ourselves with appearances and live imprisoned and dependent on them. He who lives being does not need to surround himself with appearances, nor does he need anything external. He can live in a prison or in a cave, but he will always learn from what surrounds him and will always be free. He who lives committed to his own reality cannot learn anything new. He needs to surround himself with a million appearances. Only behind them can he feel safe. He can reside in a castle or in a forest, when in reality he lives in an internal prison. He who is in prison is free. He who is compromised lives imprisoned, even if he dwells in a castle. Let us be wary of those who need castles to live. They are the most unhappy, and besides, they will always try to impose their own structure on us, since they feel that making us accept it is the only way to give it reality. 20th, of love. There is something in the history, and in the being of two people, that predisposes them to love each other when they meet. If someone could go through the two stories in their totality, and from the beginning, he would understand. When someone begins to ask himself the reasons why he loves the other, he almost always finds those that seem logical, those that are part of a structure, but never, when his desire is to find an answer, does he find the real one. The stories are multiple, and the encounters can be multiple. To love does not only mean to be able to see the other person fly. Loving has another component. It is a coincidence of stories, an almost mystical experience where the true reason for the feeling is hidden, never clear, but it has such strength and content that nothing deep down can destroy it. We ask ourselves the reason of our affinity, and we always do it when we think we have the answer beforehand. We do not realize that the world is much more complex, wonderful, and surprising than what we can think of it. 21st. of the units. To expect something is to depend. 22nd. Invalidations. Yesterday, I understood that I must not invalidate my affinities, that these always have more depth than I, when I question them, can imagine. I understood that the world is much richer, more complex and subtle than any construction that tries to explain it. I knew that this is wonderful, and that I have a responsibility to let the universe teach me. I must prevent it from being boxed in, and even more, that the other in myself considers it clear and transparent. I learned that I must learn, that I must be able to see and let the infinite information provided not be inhibited by agreements, ad hoc considerations, or constructions. Yesterday, I learned to respect the universe. That indicates that I am learning to respect myself. 23rd. Knowledge. Previously, I had been led to believe that there were two types of knowledge. One, formed by external data that could be used in case of a problem, offered during a conversation or used to defeat an argument, data with which statistics could be made and objective conclusions could be reached. The other was that which resulted from some experience, which was felt as part of oneself and made one learn from life. It was the knowledge that could not be offered as an objective argument, from which no graphs or statistics could be obtained. The knowledge of me, of my experiences and experiences, what I felt and kept as a treasure, what could not be transmitted as external, quantifiable, and measurable data. I believe that these two types of knowledge could be separated, archived in different memories without interfering with each other. He thought he could act using the first type in certain circumstances and in others the second. Now I know that there is only one type of knowledge. The second, what I thought was the first type, does not really exist. All knowledge must be part of me, otherwise it does not exist. 24th. Of being and circumstances. We are accustomed to hear that one must be according to circumstances, that one cannot be oneself at a masquerade ball, as if one were giving a lecture, that it is necessary to adapt oneself to the circumstances and act in conformity with them. It is obvious that he who has this idea is not, he only plays at being. He thinks that his conduct must necessarily lead to the acceptance of others, and it is they, therefore, who determine the way he should act. The very idea of being the same in any circumstance frightens and distresses him. He thinks that what he feels has no reality, that what is real is how the other sees it. He thinks that the other is what he manifests. The man who owns a bank is a banker. The one who drives a truck is a driver. The one who bakes bread is a baker. Since they are all different, he believes he must act accordingly. He is never himself. He never considers that being is more important than playing at being what the other expects. How to explain to him that we are all men, that some of us develop different activities, but that we are never the activities, that this is only the appearance. 25th. Language and structures. The most subtle and effective way of transmitting a structure is through the teaching of a language. The child who sees a man deliver milk in the morning knows very well that milk is milk, and that man is man. We destroy that wisdom, we teach him to speak, we tell him, he is a milkman, this one is a carpenter, and that one is a teacher. The little boy begins to believe that man is his manifestation, that he is entirely what he does, and he himself says that as he grows up he will become an activity. He will be what others have defined and accepted him to be. He cannot remember that once the man he saw was simply a man, let alone accept that he himself is one too. He learns to play at being, and begins to need others to teach him what is appropriate and expected for each being situation. He thinks beforehand that it is impossible to act wisely, since that wisdom implies data that he must acquire. He cannot remember that the simplest thing is to know, and that this knowledge is always the same, regardless of the activity being developed. 26th, of wealth. Some people need to surround themselves with sophisticated situations. They have their daily meals served by waiters, they are transported in chauffeur-driven limousines, and they paint themselves with oil paints. They attend dazzling parties and cannot bear not to be observed and admired. They are ashamed of not being in the latest fashion, and feel unhappy when, in a competition of appearances, they are defeated. Poor people, they think they are happy and can't stand to spend a minute with themselves because they are bored. They are only happy when they are surrounded by people who have excelled or are considered very important. These are the people who depend the most on the acceptance that others show them. They are never themselves. They are always what others want them to be. Their self-contempt is so great that they despise everyone they consider inferior. Their need to be accepted by important people reflects their belief that, by this association alone, they will acquire for themselves the importance that the other possesses. Their relationships always tend to make them the property or object of the other's use. Such people are so ignorant of their situation that they even try to pass it on to their children. The latter generally live in terror and react to it in various ways. They either decide to accept the path offered to them, becoming absolutely dependent, or they reject it, showing the most convincing signs of independence. Even if the manifestation is different, it basically represents the same thing, i.e., a dependence on dependence or a dependence on independence. There is, however, a third form of reaction which consists in closing oneself in on oneself without properly accepting or rejecting the path. The people who decide for this are those who desperately search for the self and those who ultimately ever find it. 27th, of detecting. Sometimes we detect something in our environment. We have the sensation that an event has occurred that, at that moment, seems very real to us. At others, we sense that the person with whom we are relating had a thought, idea, sensation, or even a feeling. Most of the time, the only thing we do in such circumstances is to inhibit that detection, considering its occurrence and its reality impossible. We never ascertain the veracity of our detections. Beforehand, we subject them to a structure that postulates that this type of perception is impossible, that it is only a fantasy. The reality of things may be very different. We probably have a much more subtle mechanism for detecting events than we can imagine. At the very least, it is worth putting it to the test. Perhaps, if we manage to discard the inhibitory structure and begin to trust ourselves more, we will discover that detecting is something real and beautiful. 28th, of responses and relationships. When a child has been subjected during the entire first stage of his development to a continuous situation of pressure, aimed at making him accept a structure in which the only important thing is the appropriate external manifestation, and aimed at achieving the acceptance of the other, the child thus pressured can choose, among others, 3 different ways of responding. The first of these is unconditional acceptance of the structure. In this case, the child will become an extroverted being, unconcerned with his inner reality, and the only thing he will want is to be accepted by the other. His whole existence will be based on the principle that man's greatest value is his community life, and the satisfactions that result from it. He will always be able to feel at ease in a gathering, and will do everything possible to integrate himself into a society that accepts him and gives him its value. As long as this society exists, he will have no problems. He will flee from contact with himself and from loneliness, for it is completely strange and distressing to him. He will be able to do everything in which the majority agrees. He will be the perfect soldier, or the perfect fascist. If the value accepted by those around him is death, he will kill. If rigidity, he will be rigid. If genocide, he will have no problems of conscience. If, as a reaction to his real nullity, this society begins to think of the Superman, thereby assigning to himself a redeeming role, he will feel superior. These are the people who most readily accept a leader, since he represents the structure of acceptance and the absence of loneliness. People like this will never need to ask themselves whether what they are doing is right or wrong. It will be enough for them to know how others evaluate them, and they will act in accordance with that evaluation. Since they have never been themselves, such people will be able, without any inhibition, to make use of the other as an object of satisfaction. In fact, this is what they do all their lives. They use the other as an object to feel satisfied with themselves. In other words, the response of this child, subjected to the pressure of the structure, will be absolute dependence. The second possible response is a total reaction against the structure. The child who responds in this way becomes autistic. Nothing around him is of interest to him. He cannot accept being used, and he has a clear and complete vision of what the other is trying to do with him. He withdraws into himself and is never able to communicate. He is suspicious of everything and everyone. He is himself, but as a confrontation to the imposition of others, not as a personal discovery. He is the perfect anarchist or schizophrenic ideal. The only activity he develops is that which implies revenge for his reactive nullity. Therefore, he takes pleasure in destroying. For what he really wants is to destroy himself. Nothing that happens around him is beautiful. Since everything is directed against him, he seeks explanations for the actions of others, and the only ones he knows are those that indicate to him that the motivation of the other is always to attack and destroy him. Apparently he is independent and free, but in reality he lives in an absolute prison. He depends on the other to do the opposite of what the other expects him to do, without realizing that the other is in him. The third possibility of response is intermediate. It is neither the first nor the second. It is something intermingled and at the same time different. The child who chooses this response lives in fear of the structure, but is incapable of totally opposing it, and even more, of accepting it. He does not know or imagine what the motivations of others are. They become something magical to him. He will never think that they want to use him as an object, but rather he will trust that the others want his good, and therefore he will act accordingly. He will feel obliged to do things he does not really want to do, not because he unconditionally accepts the structure, but because he simply cannot believe it exists. He considers that others can only have the same kind intentions as he does, and never imagines that the possibility exists that the other is using him to diminish an insecurity. Thus, he will be incapable of refusing any desire of the other. If he were to do so, he would immediately experience a feeling of guilt and feel the need to justify himself. He will never be able to see malice in the other, since it is alien to him. He will feel guilty for not doing what the other wishes him to do, for he will always think that the other is good and cannot be wrong, nor can he have other intentions than those that necessarily lead to being. He will always be naive and can be the object of anyone's use. We tend to label a person with these characteristics as weak, when what really happens to him is that he is not capable of understanding the motivations of those around him. This inability is not the result of an intellectual deficiency. It is simply the reflection of extreme naivety. This type of response is only found in those who are desperately seeking to become themselves, and who are absolutely certain that those around them are not playing games or trying to impose, but simply being themselves. The feeling that others are and they are not leads them to ask themselves continuously if the activity they develop brings them closer to being, or distances them from being. They are always preoccupied with trying to resolve this question. They always feel isolated and are never satisfied to be simply with others, since they place themselves in a plane of inferiority resulting from their sensation of not being. They are not capable of integrating into a group, nor of distancing themselves entirely from it. They live playing roles, desperately hoping that one of them will make them feel that they are. A certain sense of pride, based on the idea that continuous worry and inner questioning are the only valuable activity for a human being, coexists in these people, with an attitude of absolute unimportance towards everything they do. They feel that no activity that results directly from a personal taste or desire has any significance. They cannot come to the conclusion that what they do has any value in itself, because they analyze everything and make it depend on the structure of guilt and justification that has been created in them. In other words, they invalidate any activity that they cannot justify as truly necessary for the well-being of the other. Therefore, only that which results in this well-being seems important to them. If the activity has only a connection with themselves, without being able to cause direct welfare to the other, then that activity is unimportant. It is precisely this feeling of unimportance and absolute invalidation that makes these people keep looking for answers and at the same time not find them. They tend to dichotomize their behavior into that which is worthwhile and that which is not. The latter is generally associated with personal satisfaction. The former is determined by the satisfaction it may cause in others. When they perform an activity that they have previously labeled as unimportant and worthless, they feel guilty and need to justify to others the need to perform the activity. At that point, they are extremely cautious. They will invent 1,001 reasons that they believe will make the listener realize how necessary and important the activity they are doing is, when in truth the only justification for it should be to do it. Probably such a need for justification comes from the fact that someone, in the first stage of the development of these people, saw the need to make them, since they were children, give a continuous justification to their actions. The introjection of this need produced a person who requires continuous justification before others and experiences a feeling of emptiness when such justification is not possible. On the other hand, it is very clear that the way these people carry out their activities is also dichotomized. For those who are worthwhile, they use a strict methodology, and their activity is characterized by obsessiveness and rigidity. On the other hand, those who are not worthwhile carry out their activities without method, in a careless and fluctuating manner. People who have chosen the third response always feel obligated to others, because they think they must do everything possible so that they do not feel hurt, regardless of what happens to themselves. They make the other person believe that they agree with their structures, not because they are hypocritical, but with the sole purpose of not making the person who manifests them feel bad. They do not tolerate anyone to be emotionally dependent on them, and even less to fall into dependencies themselves. However, they tend to depend on those who like to use men as objects, since they are not able to see the real intention of the user, because they do not conceive that such a motivation exists, because it does not exist in themselves. They agree to depend as a result of their desire not to hurt someone who apparently needs them so much. These people show continuous fluctuations in their behavior. At times they act in a manner entirely similar to that of the one who chose the first response, and at others, like the one who chose the second response, these fluctuations are nothing more than escapes from a situation that is beginning to become untenable. Probably the fluctuation that occurs most frequently is the one associated with the second response, i.e., a self-enclosure. What happens when two people who have chosen the same or different responses meet? If they both belong to the first answer, the character of their relationship will be entirely commercial or legal. They will manifest all the behaviors that those around them consider identifiable with love. However, nothing will be further away than that feeling. What will sustain the relationship will be a simple pact or agreement, and the only likely sentiment will be fear of loss. Each will use the other as an object for personal use. If both belong to the second response, the relationship will be extremely destructive. What will bind them together will be only a competitive drive, a race that each will try to win over the other. If one belongs to the first and the other to the second, the relationship will have sadomasochistic components. The former will submit unconditionally to the decisions of the latter. The latter, in turn, will feel the right and authority to impose any consideration, following a gradient in which the first pressures will be relatively light and innocuous, and as it meets no resistance, the level of reactivity will increase and increase until it reaches dramatic extremes. The relationship between a person who has chosen the first response and another who has chosen the third response will be characterized by the continuous appearance of feelings of guilt in the person who has chosen the third response, and of permanent frustration in the person who has chosen the first response. Neither will be able to offer the other what he or she really needs. The person who has chosen the first will try to use the other as a vehicle to diminish his insecurity, and the person who has chosen the third will fall into the deepest of dependencies. He will want to do no harm, and will acquiesce in front of the user. A completely structured and therefore redundant, empty, and false situation will emerge. If the relationship is established between a person who chose the second response and another who chose the third, the only possible outcome will be the acceptance of the structure by the latter, followed by a rejection of it. The relationship will be characterized by its fluctuating character. Powerful bonds of interdependence will be established, which will make it extremely difficult to understand the real character of the relationship. Only at the moment when the person of the third response becomes aware of the management that has been imposed on him, there will be a reaction that may consist in the rejection of the relationship with the consequent search for new paths, or in his sinking into the deepest of depressions. The relationship between two people who have chosen the third response is the most interesting and complex. Because of its intensity, its reality, and because it goes through different stages and phases, each of which brings the two closer to the self, this indicates that of all the possible relationships mentioned, this is probably the purest. 29th, of manipulations. There are people who feel a great need to apply emotional blackmail to others. This blackmail is nothing more than a manipulation by which the one who uses it wishes to feel that he has absolute power and domination over another person. Manipulation consists of creating feelings of guilt through a continuous complaint about the damage that the person to be manipulated has caused to the manipulator. Statements such as, "Look how bad I am because of you," or "Look how much you make me suffer, and what I am sacrificing just because you are happy," etc., create in those to whom they are directed a feeling that, out of necessity, they must give in to what they do not want to do, so that the person who has sacrificed so much can have at least some satisfaction. Of course, such assertions are never justified. They always arise from the deep insecurity of the one who uses them, and moreover, from a deep-seated conviction that no one has the right to do what he or she really wants. This conviction is simply the reaction to a situation in which the person who needs to manipulate has placed himself. Such a situation is always one in which what that person really wants or intends is blocked or prevented by some structure or commitment. That is, the person who manipulates is not free, and therefore does not live the way he or she would like to live. Precisely because of this, he/she believes that no one has the right to live freely, and therefore believes she has the authority to manipulate and subdue. The person with this structure becomes its guardian and custodian. All those who depend in one way or another on that structure are subjected to custody. People thus subjected can react in many ways. One of them consists of unconditional acceptance of the domination. Another may be their absolute rejection. The one who has chosen rejection is lucky. Of course, she will suffer many impositions, but she will maintain an emotional independence that will later make her be herself. The one who has chosen acceptance will always feel insecure about expressing something she desires or thinking about something that is tacitly opposed to the structure that has been tried to impose on her. Her relationships with other people and with herself will always be associated with the need to maintain an appearance. At the same time, she will feel entitled and obliged to guard the structure that has been imposed on her and to impose it on others. Obviously, the original situation has been transmitted, and this transmission perpetuates the need for imposition. Only at the moment when the people who have the need to impose structures begin to discover their own worth, only then will they begin to change, and that change will always involve throwing away their entire history. 30th. Of the necessity of imposing. The need to impose a structure has as its basis and motive the idea that the one on whom it is imposed is simply a property, and the one who imposes it, the owner. It implies a basic and definitive lack of respect for the thinking capacity of both, the one who imposes and the one who receives it. The reason for the latter is very easy to glimpse. The structure fixes and determines explicitly which behaviors are expected and which are expected. When following the rules associated with a structure, it is not necessary to think, nor is there any risk of making a mistake. On the other hand, when trusting oneself, there is a risk. If the person knew himself, he would know that it is always more productive to leave the mediatory processes of thought unimpeded, because in such conditions of disinhibition, these processes take place and manifest themselves much more creatively than when they are blocked by determinism. The insecurity that these people feel about themselves is what explains all these behaviors. This insecurity is in turn determined by an analytical attitude with which they continually evaluate their behaviors and the motivations associated with them. Such an attitude was in turn created by someone who imposed the need for appraisal, by judging the acts and behavioral manifestations of someone who thus became analytical. On the other hand, the need to impose a structure arises paradoxically from the insecurity one has about its value. This insecurity drives one to try to convince the other of the necessity and importance of accepting the structure. The one who imposes the structure wants it to be accepted by the other, since such acceptance would imply giving more reality to the structure, and therefore would diminish the basic insecurity about its value. If the person were entirely sure of what he thinks, he would not need to impose anything at all, since his thoughts in that situation would not require any agreement to become more real. They would be real by themselves. The idea that getting the agreement of the other gives greater reality to an idea or concept arises from the process of socialization in which we are taught to think that the most important value is to share realities with the people around us. On the other hand, the idea that it is necessary to achieve the agreement of the other in order to consider something as real comes from the functioning of the pontifical mechanism of deciding realities, which has as its basic premise to consider that something has physical reality as long as everyone agrees to consider it as such. An idea can never have the same character as an object, and therefore it is not necessary that it be shared for it to acquire reality. This truth is not recognized by the decider of realities, who rather thinks the opposite and therefore acts accordingly. Thus, through the influence of the decider, we submit our thoughts to the verdict of agreement. If this is achieved, we will have no problems, but if not, we will begin to doubt ourselves. We will have subordinated our inner reality to the general consensus. The stupid thing about this whole process is that the one to whom our internal reality is subordinated has exactly the same mechanism of dependence on agreement as we do. In this way, each one depends on the acceptance of his internal reality by the other. Hence, the only thing that emerges from this situation is absurdity and the most tragic comedy. 31st of the Trilogy, Superiority, Inferiority, Dependence. One of the most disastrous experiences that can happen to a child is to develop in a family where the idea that, either because of its economic situation or its intellectual situation, another family is on a superior plane, continually surfaces. Hearing that their parents consider themselves inferior provokes in the child a series of very intense doubts about his or her own value. In this situation, the child may begin to think that by nature, he does not possess the necessary conditions to achieve what he really wants. His rights are inhibited in advance by the idea that those around him are always better or wiser, and he believes, therefore, that his performance must lead him to be accepted by them. Equally or more disastrous is the opposite experience, that is, when the family or group to which the child belongs has the fantasy of being better and superior to those around him. Both situations have dependence in common. The child begins to consider it more important to conform to the external way in which others define him/her as superior or inferior, and does not create in him/her the security that he/she is the only one capable of defining him/herself. 32nd of the expression of thought. It is common experience to feel that we cannot communicate all that we think. The reason for this difficulty is twofold. In the first place, we possess inhibitory mechanisms that are activated the moment we make an assessment of the effect that saying what we think may have on others. Of course, that appraisal only results from an insecurity of ourselves, and from the structure according to which it is more important how the other sees and accepts me than how I really am. The inhibitory mechanisms that are set in motion in situations such as these are the probable result of a process of interference between the mechanism that translates internal information into verbal behavior and the setting in motion of the mechanism associated with the valuing process. Sometimes the valorization process is not associated with the acceptance structure, but simply with the idea that the other is not capable of understanding what is really being thought. The result in this case is similar to the previous one. There is an internal inhibition that prevents communication. The effect of inhibition is not only a decrease in the number of verbalizations, but also an alteration in their veracity. One begins to say things that one does not really think, and this leads to a situation of falsification in the expression of the internal reality that produces a feeling of high frustration. Difficulty in communication also has another reason. Our thought processes are generally faster than any known system for representing them. The amount of information that we handle at any given moment is so great that the verbalization process is only set in motion at the instant when we reach a conclusion or integration resulting from all the previous handling. If we verbalize only the resultant, without mentioning the whole process of information management that led us to it, the only thing we will achieve is that whoever listens to us will not understand us. We should therefore try to reproduce in our verbal communications not only the conclusions we reach, but also the whole sequence of data handling that led us to them. However, when we try to do so, we encounter two almost insurmountable obstacles. First, the time it would take us to communicate the entire sequence would be extremely long. Second, the exact reproduction of the sequence is extremely difficult to achieve, for the simple reason that many of the internal processes that led us to a given resultant are not verbal in nature, and even if they were, we would most likely not be able to remember them. The exact communication of our thought processes is only possible when we meet someone who handles information that runs through sequences similar to ours, and who, therefore, can understand our verbal results. The coincidence in sequences probably occurs as a result of similar personal histories. This similarity and the observation that the other person is able to understand produce a feeling of maximum affinity and attraction in which inhibition and interference, generally associated with communication processes, disappear. When this occurs, the people who are communicating begin to discover themselves, each through the discovery of the other, and begin to like and love the other by liking and loving themselves. Only in such a situation is the direct transmission of inner experiences possible. 33rd of the poet. A poet is he who has sufficient talent to offer a verbal resultant and to provide with it and between the lines the whole sequence from which said resultant arises. It is a rare privilege that requires a profound knowledge of human anti-comedy. 34th, of the leaders and their dependencies. The appearance of a great leader is a spectacular and determining event in the history of a people. The leader is considered by his followers as a god, an untouchable who never errs in his decisions. The people submit to his will and turn him into the image of what is desirable, pure, and authentic. There is no doubt that there have been leaders who were themselves and who wished to transmit their teachings and not impose them. Cases like those of Buddha, Confucius, and Jesus are characteristic. There is also no doubt that most of the leaders represented comedies and insecurities in their leadership. Typical examples: Hitler and Mussolini. The essential difference between the two types of leaders lies in the fact that the former wished to transmit experiences of being themselves, thus trying to make others be themselves as well. The motivation of the latter, on the other hand, was to impose structures. They were so insecure about themselves that they were only interested in getting their followers to accept their structures at all costs in order to make them more real. The followers saw these leaders as the representatives of personal security and independence, and did not realize that they, their leaders, depended on the acceptance of others in order to be themselves, and were therefore the most dependent and insecure of all those around them. The need for acceptance manifested itself in all their behaviors, from the great value and emphasis they placed on their personal appearance, to the impressive, theatrical, and dramatic nature of their speeches. People who accept a leader with these characteristics are those who have been trained to consider the external manifestation or appearance as synonymous with the internal reality, which is precisely why they continually need the acceptance that the other gives them. The appearance of the puppet leader and the acceptance of him by his followers is only a comedy of mutual insecurities that are falsely diminished by sharing structures. 35th, on being a spectator of itself. It often happens that people who have a long history of impositions are continually spectators of themselves. Only rarely can they live a situation feeling that they participate in it, without questioning their participation. Generally, they evaluate their behavior using as a parameter whether it conforms to a certain structure. If the result of their evaluation indicates that the situation does not correspond to the goals or ideals set by the structure, they begin to feel annoyed and unable to integrate and live what is happening around them. If the result of their evaluation indicates that the situation does correspond to the ideal, they begin to experience a fluctuating sensation characterized by a state close to tranquility, interrupted suddenly and without apparent cause by the need to analyze the situation around them and evaluate the role they play in it. Their analysis is characterized by questioning the effect they are having on those around them and whether others feel comfortable in their presence. The analysis and the resulting evaluation are always circular and redundant in the sense that those who analyze their own participation are absolutely certain that others are doing exactly the same. They are never able to conceive that the others could have a different way of functioning. The feeling of the analyzer is twofold. On the one hand, he feels that it would be desirable to simply live without thinking about living. On the other hand, he feels proud of the analysis he performs, because he believes that this activity represents the most valuable thing a human being can do. This idea makes him value others according to whether they are accustomed to analyze themselves, as he does, or whether they simply live without being spectators of themselves. Those who fall into the first category are considered valuable, while those who belong to the second category are considered simple and mediocre. In other words, the person who is used to being a spectator of himself has the hidden need for everyone to do the same. Only then does he consider them valuable. If we carefully consider the mechanism associated with the situation described, we will realize that it arises from a person who, accustomed to obeying impositions, does nothing but issue impositions. Being a spectator of oneself prevents one from having real experiences, inhibits any possibility of learning from life, since life thus becomes so clear and transparent, so obviously defined and definable, that nothing new happens. 36th of understanding. When someone has stopped playing because he considers himself more valuable than his own games, he begins to see in others aspects and conditions that he was previously incapable of perceiving. In the first place, he can detect the instant when someone begins to play. Detection is relatively simple. It occurs when the other person begins to show dependence, the need to accept a structure or to have it imposed on him. Detection, in addition to preventing the one who detects from falling into the game that the other is starting to use, has an extremely interesting effect. The person begins to be able to understand that the one playing is not the game. In other words, he can discriminate the person himself as separate from his games. He no longer identifies appearance with being, no longer confuses the external manifestation with the internal reality of the other, since he no longer confuses them within himself. If the other manifests great snobbery, he no longer sees him as a snob, but, on the contrary, understands that such an attitude only arises from an inner insecurity. If the other tries to impose a structure, he no longer sees it as autocratic or imposing, but rather understands that this need arises from a desire to share an internal reality that is faltering. In that circumstance, you begin to love people. You are absolutely certain that they are good and valuable, but you know that they have problems to solve that manifest themselves in many different ways. The person who plays games generally does so to create an insurmountable barrier that prevents the other person from peering inside him or her. The fear that this interior is not desirable and satisfactory makes the person become impenetrable. At that moment, behaviors appear that are used to inhibit any attempt at penetration. One such behavior may be overt or covert aggression. If the aggression is directed against someone who does not yet understand, a situation of mutual defense and hostility is created. If, on the other hand, the aggression is directed against someone who does understand, the only possible outcome is a reduction in aggression. The person who understands the reasons for the aggression will never respond with hostility, but rather will try to get the aggressor to stop playing games and see himself as someone of value who does not need to use subterfuge. It is not a kind and compassionate attitude. It is only the result of considering that within all of us there are more important and valuable things than games. The life of the one who understands becomes extraordinarily interesting and intense. Every instant is surrounded by a magic that invites meditation. Every relationship with someone becomes extraordinarily productive and directed to the being. A person in these conditions ceases to be confused with the comedies and games used by those around him. On the contrary, these comedies and games only teach him that man is, in himself, a god, and that his manifestations of hatred, aggression, authoritarianism, etc., are only signs of a path that he is traveling, and that is always directed towards the encounter with himself. 37th. Of the causes. If we would at least try to understand the true cause and raison d'etre of games, we would never hate. If we could only understand that the causes of games are always the desire to stop playing them, we would love. Just one example is enough to understand this. Someone can continuously manifest the conviction that rigidity and authoritarianism in education are completely necessary. The conviction is so intense that this person tries by all means to convince us of its certainty. There are two ways of looking at such a person. One is to label him as rigid and authoritarian. The other is to understand that his apparent rigidity and authoritarianism are only the product of an internal insecurity that arises in turn from the idea, imposed on him by someone else, that there is nothing valuable in himself, and therefore in others either, and that it is therefore necessary to create rigid and authoritarian conditions to build what is valuable. If someone manages to understand that the need this person feels to establish a rigid and authoritarian structure is only a reflection of the distrust in his own value, and that this distrust was imposed on him by someone who taught him not to consider himself valuable, he stops perceiving him as rigid and authoritarian and begins to understand him as someone who is insecure about himself. He also knows that the moment that person begins to see himself, the whole structure of rigidity and authoritarianism will fall under its own weight, since he will understand that we have a much more valuable and serious mechanism than any situation that pretends to create it, and he will also understand that the idea of imposing structures in education only leads to inhibit the possibility of it happening. Therefore, the reaction of the person who understands the true causes of apparent authoritarianism will not be one of hatred. Rather, she understands that such authoritarianism is a reaction to a situation of internal insecurity, and that therefore the authoritarian person is valuable and only plays. This perception of the value of the other person makes one love him/her, and not confuse the simple manifestation of a game with an internal reality. In addition, it encourages transmitting to this person the idea that she is valuable and has no need or reason to feel insecure. A productive relationship aimed at understanding reality will develop, and not a destructive and hostile one. All this as a result of simply being able to understand the causes of a game. 38th. Of philosophy. Ludwig Wittgenstein once warned his pupil Malcolm about the grave dangers of engaging in philosophy, for, he pointed out, there are great possibilities of deceiving oneself. What Wittgenstein probably meant is that a philosopher can begin to make theoretical manipulations of conceptual data, and forget that it is only possible to do philosophy when it results from real experiences. The moment a philosopher gives more importance to the logical analysis of a problem, he falls into the deepest of deceptions. he begins to depend on the structure of logic and theory, and thus he locks himself in a vicious circle where the handling of the problem to be solved becomes redundant and empty. The tendency to fall into this type of vice is very great, because the associated logical structure is too subtle to be detected. On the other hand, it is a common consideration that the progress of philosophical knowledge results from the logical handling of conceptual data. The truth is that philosophy as a science of man should result from the knowledge that the philosopher finds and discovers in himself, and never in a theoretical logical structure. To achieve the above, a method is required that is detached from any structure and that has as its fundamental characteristic internal questioning. Only in this way does philosophical knowledge cease to be redundant and a deception. 39th of irony. Irony results from the setting in motion of an extraordinarily subtle mechanism characterized by a mockery of games. The ironic person knows of the existence of games and believes that by mocking them he can annul them. The irony may be directed at the games of others. In that case, the nullification is only apparent. Irony of this type is only a defense of the one who applies it, to avoid discovering his own games. Mocking the games of others as a defense to ignore one's own is a particular case of a generalized process of self-deception. The latter is associated with the strange ability of human beings to recognize the errors, problems, and structures of others, and the inability to see them in themselves, even though they may have similar or even identical ones. It causes a very special sensation to hear someone make an impeccable analysis of structures associated with the behaviors of those around him, and, simultaneously, to see him incapable of recognizing that those same structures that he detects in others work in him. Such subtle self-deception can only be explained if the person using it thinks that his case is really different from that of the other person, and therefore cannot be applied to himself. But such thinking is false. It only results from the fear of facing reality. The person who possesses the same structures that he detects in the other person, but who cannot accept them as existing in himself, uses to excuse this lack of acceptance a number of logical justifications and explanations, which are always related to deterministic schemes. An example may help to understand this. Someone hears another person complain that an acquaintance, from whom he expected to receive something, has let him down. If that person is someone who has begun to understand, he will know that the complaint expressed is only part of a game into which the complainer has fallen. This game arises from the structure according to which one has property rights over the person with whom one has a relationship. He also knows that this need to be property and owner arises from an internal insecurity. In short, he is aware of the structures that this person manifests and uses. It would be logical to expect that this person who understands does not possess the same structures that he detects in the other person. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. The person who detected the complaint as a mere structure may use complaints without ever realizing that they are also a structure, although now in themselves, when he complains, he feels that he has every right to do so and that his attitude is justified. This justification is nurtured and explained by schemas such as, when someone gives something, he expects to receive something in return, or, if I love this person so much and have sacrificed myself for him, I have the right to expect him to do the same for me, etc. These are deterministic schemes that apparently justify the complaint, but in reality they are only a structure of use and ownership. This explains why it is so easy to discover structures in others and not see them in ourselves. This, in turn, explains the irony towards others. A second type of irony is that which is directed at the ironizer himself. we could call it self-irony. Self-irony implies a mockery of one's own games. To be self-ironic suggests having a very objective knowledge of one's own games and the structures associated with them. Listening to someone being self-ironic is a delightful experience in which one enjoys the deepest sense of humor one can develop. However, being self-ironic is still a defense. The one who ironizes with himself feels that by mocking his own games, he obtains the right to play them without guilt. It would be expected that the self-ironic person would not play, but unfortunately this is not the case. Self-irony in this case is only an intellectualization that does not provoke real changes. When a person does not play, he does not have to be ironic, and therefore, the one who is ironic with himself does play. 40. Of being in effect. When someone begins to think that he has a path to follow and considers it fixed and determined, he is only demonstrating that he has ceased to be a cause and has become an effect. It is others who are fixing his path and not himself. In the same way, when someone uses a logical scheme to explain everything, it means that this scheme has been discovered by someone else and has not resulted from a real experience. The two previous conditions have in common the fact that the person acts limiting himself to the determinism and structures of others, that is, as an effect, and not on the basis of his own experiences. Becoming and acting as an effect, and not as a cause, makes the world stop teaching, prevents learning, and produces a feeling of emptiness where the only important thing is to assimilate the teachings of the other. Never, in this situation, is it considered possible to make one's own discoveries. If they do occur, they are put in question, waiting for the other's evaluation and arbitration. If the other considers that the discovery is not valuable, it ceases to be so. If he considers that it has value, it ceases to be a discovery. If the other teaches the path, it is considered unchangeable and determined. If an experience occurs along the way that does not agree with the consideration of the other, it is sacrificed for the sake of that consideration. When someone ceases to marvel at the universe, he shows that he has become an effect and has ceased to be a cause. Fourfold, degree of socialization. The degree of socialization is in direct relation to the rigidity of the pontifical mechanism for deciding realities. Therefore, the capacity of imagination and the capacity of experience have an inverse relationship with the degree of socialization. Thus, someone who is not entirely socialized will be creative, imaginative, and will live his dreams as realities. 42nd, of the capacity to understand. The human brain contains between 10 and 12 billion neurons. The number of possible combinations between these elements is similar to the number of particles in the known universe. The number of specific patterns of neuronal activation is practically infinite. The complexity of the integration processes carried out by this structure is greater than that of any model that attempts to explain it. Thus, if nothing is more complicated than the brain that each of us possesses, then we can understand everything. 43rd, of rigidity and obsessiveness. Rigidity and obsessiveness always occur together and have the same causes. A rigid individual is one who cannot accept that someone expresses an opinion, idea, or behavior different from those he himself holds. In addition, it is characterized by a permanent tendency to impose structures. In spite of the contrary, the rigid person has no decision-making capacity. All his activities are a simple implementation of someone's teachings, and as such, they are always applied in an immutable way. Anything that deviates from these teachings, or that is not foreseen by them, causes him a conflictive state that he can hardly overcome. The teaching that governs him was imposed and accepted blindly, and only apparently diminished his internal insecurity. The desire to impose these same teachings has the sole purpose of establishing an agreement that gives them more reality. From this point of view, the rigid person relies on behavioral manifestation as a parameter of measurement and not on inner experience. If he were based on inner experience, he would know that any imposition is an absurdity, since it does not lead to experience. The causes of internal insecurity in the rigid person are associated with events that at some point in his life provoked great feelings of guilt that he has not been able to overcome. It is these feelings that indirectly provoke the capacity to accept impositions. The reason for this is very simple. The person who feels guilty thinks that she is not valuable, and therefore cannot make decisions. He needs someone to decide for him and show him the way. The acceptance of the latter makes change impossible, hence the rigidity, and also maintains the feeling of helplessness. The internal insecurity provokes as a reaction the obsessive behavioral manifestation. Everything outside must be ordered, structured, and arranged in such a way that there is no possibility of risk. The person who is obsessive in his behavior, and who, in this way, shows to the outside a structure of security, is insecure inside. Again, he thinks that it is the manifestation that is important and that which gives security. He is not able to feel himself or to admire himself. He needs an external order to admire. Both rigidity and obsessiveness are simple reactions to the fact that she cannot accept herself. Both are simple facades behind which the opposite of what they manifest is hidden. Both result from feelings of guilt that bring as a consequence an internal insecurity that one wishes to hide. Both the rigid and the obsessive person have forgotten that the most important thing is the inner experience, and that this cannot be transmitted. Therefore, it makes no sense to manifest it. 44th. Of Antientropy and Pandeterminism. The general tendency of the universe is toward disorder, that is, entropy. Living systems, on the other hand, have as their basic characteristic to move away from disorder or, what is the same, to be anti-entropic. The appearance of the first cell was undoubtedly the appearance of the first anti-entropic living system. The most primitive antientropic systems are those that have no determinism of their own. An amoeba does not decide its behavior. It is always determined and associated with external stimuli. If we stimulate the amoeba, it will move. If not, it will remain motionless. The number of elements that constitute the amoeba is so small that the only possible activity of this entity is that which results from specific stimulation. When the number of elements increases, the system begins to manifest more complex behaviors that begin to acquire characteristics of spontaneity. Simultaneously, the system begins to be able to represent within itself what surrounds it. When the degree of internal representation reaches a sufficient level, the system ceases to be completely determined, and the first manifestations of incipient self-determinism appear. The system begins to cease to depend on the exterior, since the latter can be introjected. The human being is probably at this stage of his evolution. The capacity for internal representation is very clearly manifested in children. Their dreams, their imaginative processes, and their games indicate the existence of a self-determinism in full development. Unfortunately, all these characteristics are blocked and inhibited during the socialization process. The child is taught that there is an external reality, and that this is the only valuable one. Moreover, he is forced to accept his internal representational processes as silly and absurd. All these teachings create a mechanism of valuation of reality that inhibits the possibility of having free experiences without evaluations and justifications. If the process is completed, the child begins to be a spectator of himself. At that moment, everything he does will be determined by what he thinks he should do, and it will no longer be possible for him to live without analyzing his experiences. It will probably take some time before man ceases to put obstacles in his way. When he does, he will be able to attain self-determinism and inner freedom. There are, however, men who at this moment are beginning to be free. They are all those who have discovered themselves to be more valuable than the structures that the process of socialization has imposed on them. When the human being becomes self-determined, he will enter a new stage of his evolution, that of Pandeterminism. This implies the capacity not only to determine oneself, but to determine the universe. It is the complete security in the capacity of internal representation, the certainty that the universe is internal and therefore manageable at will. It is something we will get to, and it would indeed be worthwhile to start now. 45th, of knowing when one is. There is a moment in life when a question arises. Of all the experiences and sensations had, which are those that represent the being, and which are comedy? The answer is very simple. It is enough to remember when one was not a spectator of oneself, when one did not think about thinking, when one did not analyze the analysis. Everything felt, lived, and experienced in those moments represents being. On the other hand, everything felt, lived, and experienced as a spectator of oneself is comedy and play. The reason is obvious. When one is a spectator of oneself, one acts according to a structure. What one lives in those moments is that structure. On the other hand, when one is not a spectator of oneself, what one lives is the experience. Whoever can remember these moments will know that in them there was never evil or selfishness, only goodness and love. This indicates that evil does not exist, that it is only a reaction and a structure, and that when the structure is discarded and the being is preserved, it is always good. 46th, of science. The person who devotes himself to science considers that the results he obtains, the form and method he uses to obtain them, as well as the theories he arrives at, have as their fundamental characteristic that of being absolutely objective and unquestionably real. He also thinks that the science that occupies him does not depend either on the epoch in which it develops or on the culture that sustains it, which is absolutely false. Science is always the product of the activity of a man with a particular history. Both the way of approaching nature and the theories that arise from that approach are inseparable from the history of the scientist. One example suffices to validate this assertion. Our culture holds as a basic premise that reality exists, regardless of who perceives it. At the same time, it thinks that an object is real as long as many observers agree that it is. Simultaneously, it considers that the internal reality that cannot be shared has a subordinate and secondary character with respect to the reality that is shared. These considerations are reflected in neurophysiological science. With rare exceptions, most studies of the electrical activity of sensory systems have made determinations about what stimuli make a neuron respond and not about the characteristics of the response patterns in that cell. Such a predilection for studying neuronal activity in terms of external stimuli rather than internal activation patterns has retarded knowledge of the neurophysiological coding of information. Moreover, the emphasis on the external stimulus and its physical characteristics as the direct determinant of a neural response promotes a very dogmatic approach to the study of the brain. In such an approach, the brain is seen as a deterministic machine that responds directly and invariably to the physical characteristics of stimuli, and not as a plastic system that changes its responses depending on the memories that are activated by stimuli that are only real and therefore perceptible as long as they evoke an internal activation pattern. From this point of view, perceptual systems are considered as performing a linear duplication of the external world, when in fact the perception of an object is inseparable from the evocation of the corresponding information stored in memory. Thus there is no duplication of the external world, but rather a construction of it. The interest that neurophysiological science places on the physical characteristics of stimuli is only explicable if we think that it comes from researchers who have been socialized in a culture that considers external events as the only valid and real thing and internal events as false and unreal. We must remember that science is a human activity, and that, therefore, it depends in its approach and its theories on the particular history and culture of the man who develops it. 47th, of fear. The only reason that prevents us from daring to be ourselves is the fear that instills in us to abandon the structures, because of the idea that, if we do so, the only thing that would result would be chaos, unhappiness, and despair. Since we never try to be ourselves, we cannot find out whether such assumption and fears are founded or not. We hide behind the fact that everyone around us has the same fear as we do, and furthermore, they claim that the only possible outcome of such daring would be unhappiness. We never stop to think that they have not dared to do so either, and therefore do not know with certainty what the outcome will be. Moreover, the fear we feel, in addition to being based on the opinion of others, is reinforced by the idea that questioning that opinion would cause others to reject us and stop loving us. If only we would remember that the world we live in and the structures on which it is based have been responsible, so far this century, for the death of tens of millions of men. If only we would remember the hypocrisy that surrounds us, the poverty that envelops us, the injustice in which we are immersed. If only we would stop being satisfied with so much, we would dare to dare. Only then would we discover the truth. The only thing that being myself leads to is to love myself and everything around me. We would know that all the lack of love before was only the result of considering agreements and structures as the most significant thing. We would know that our inner reality is more important and valuable than any game, and that the result of doing what we really are, and not what others expect us to do, is the opposite of unhappiness, chaos and hopelessness. At that moment, every moment of our life would become the most important and valuable thing. We would love anyone with whom we interact, and all this as a result of loving, trusting, and being ourselves. 48th, of the self. The last stage of the change towards being occurs when the dichotomies end. When what is done coincides point to point with what is thought. When everything is important and valuable, and hierarchies cease to be hierarchical. When complacency disappears completely. When it ceases to be of interest that others notice the change. When every stimulus and every situation teaches. When we stop giving different value to things. When everything becomes one and the same. When you stop analyzing analysis and stop thinking about thinking. When you stop thinking about being and you are. When you stop acting for the sake of receiving approval. When one stops preaching and imposing and only transmits. When one lives without valuing the experience. When we love everything and everyone. When one is free. when you get to be. We are naive and at the same time ingenious. The conflict of deciding to accept the reality of our inner self, we transfer it, in an act of supreme audacity and hypocrisy, to the decision of the other when the other does the same. We blame the outside for our problems because we are incapable of conceiving that everything results from a reality that, in desperation, we try to preserve. We are sure the reader will read these pages in one sitting, as will we. The end. If you liked this audiobook, share it with the people you appreciate the most. Thank you for following the channel Bending Realities. A big hug, and may the infinite wisdom of the Creator guide you always.